Section 1. The nuclear power plant is poisoning Springfield. Settle in, get comfortable, pull the blanket up a little, because tonight we are going somewhere familiar. Somewhere warm and strange and yellow. Somewhere that has been sitting in the back of your mind since you were a kid watching cartoons on a Sunday night, not fully understanding why the jokes felt like they were about something bigger than jokes. We are going to Springfield, and we are going to stay there for a while. The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989. 36 seasons. Nearly 800 episodes. It is the longest-running American animated series in the history of television, the longest-running American sitcom, and the longest-running scripted primetime show that has ever existed. A show that has been running continuously for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. In all that time, across every single one of those episodes, nobody in Springfield has aged a single day. Bart Simpson is still 10 years old. Lisa is still 8. Maggie still has that pacifier. Homer still shuffles into the same nuclear power plant every morning to work the same console under the same fluorescent lights for the same ancient billionaire who cannot reliably remember his name. The town looks the same. The streets feel the same. Evergreen Terrace is exactly as it always was. And for 36 years, nobody inside Springfield has stopped and asked why. But tonight, we are going to ask. Quietly. Slowly. The way you explore something when there is no rush and the room is dark and all you have to do is listen. We are going to start with the theory that sits underneath everything else. The one that does not just explain one strange thing about Springfield, the one that explains all of them. The Springfield nuclear power plant is mutating the entire town. Not as a metaphor, not as a background joke that the writers put in to add texture. Literally, physically, biologically mutating every person, every animal, and possibly every square inch of ground in Springfield. And the evidence for this has been accumulating in plain sight since the show's second season, dropped into episode after episode like breadcrumbs along a trail that the residents of Springfield are constitutionally incapable of following. Let's move slowly through it. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, and it is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town. That much is established very early. What is also established early, though the show presents it in a way designed to make you laugh rather than feel alarmed, is that the plant is a catastrophe. A surprise safety inspection conducted at the plant found 342 separate violations. Not a handful of paperwork issues, not a few outdated fire extinguishers. 342 documented violations of nuclear safety protocol. The estimated cost to bring the facility up to code was $56 million. Burns declined to spend it. The plant continued operating. And the violations themselves are not minor bureaucratic details. Radioactive waste was being dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive material was found on children's playgrounds. Plutonium rods were being used as paperweights on someone's desk inside the facility. Cooling towers that had developed cracks were patched with chewing gum. Luminous rats, glowing with absorbed radiation, were running through the corridors and maintenance tunnels of an active nuclear plant. And in the basement, inspectors found human skeletons. The show mentions this and then moves on without comment. Human skeletal remains in the basement of a working reactor facility, and the narrative simply continues to the next scene. The person whose job it is to prevent all of this from happening is Homer Simpson. Homer's role at the power plant is safety inspector, which means he is the last line of defense between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. The show's own creator has stated that Homer has an IQ of 55. An episode in season 12 reveals that Homer has had a wax crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, a foreign object that has been physically reducing his cognitive function for his entire life. Homer regularly sleeps at his workstation. He has eaten donuts during active meltdown warnings. He once dropped a donut into the reactor core out of idle curiosity to see what would happen. That man has been Springfield's primary nuclear safety official for over 3 decades. Now, here is where the evidence starts to build into something genuinely difficult to dismiss. In Season 2, a fisherman pulls a catch from the river near the power plant and discovers something unusual. The fish has 3 eyes. A mutation. A visible, undeniable biological mutation in a creature living in water downstream from a nuclear facility with 342 unaddressed safety violations. The fish's name becomes Blinky. Blinky becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as a centerpiece of his campaign, arguing that Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns is pressured into eating the fish on live television to demonstrate that it is safe. The town watches, and then the town shrugs. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts a follow-up study on the river. Nobody asks what seems like the most obvious question imaginable. If the fish in this water have developed a third eye, what is the water doing to the people who drink it? The show does not answer that question directly, but it has been answering it indirectly for 30 years. Look at the residents of Springfield. Really look at them. Homer Simpson has a skull shape that does not conform to normal human anatomy. He has bulging eyes, a pronounced overbite, and 4 fingers on each hand. His IQ, as noted, falls into clinical disability range. His body absorbs physical trauma at a rate that has no biological explanation. He has been shot, electrocuted, thrown from cliffs, struck by vehicles, caught in explosions, buried alive, and launched from catapults. He survives all of it. His healing rate is not cartoon exaggeration so much as a biological impossibility. His pain tolerance seems to operate on a completely different register from anything a normal human body should be capable of. Marge Simpson has the same bulging eyes. She has hair that grows straight upward in a fixed tower shape, defying gravity and physics, and has maintained the exact same form for 36 years. She worked at the nuclear power plant briefly. She was employed there. She was exposed to the same violations, the same leaking radiation, the same atmospheric contamination that Homer breathes every day. Their 3 children, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie, were all conceived and born in Springfield, all raised in the same contaminated environment, all displaying physical traits that do not occur naturally in uncontaminated human populations. The spiky hair that holds its shape without any product, the overbites, the yellow skin. The yellow skin is particularly significant. Every resident of Springfield has the same unusual yellow skin tone, and this is where the theory reaches its sharpest point. When guest characters arrive in Springfield from outside the town, they look different. Their proportions are more natural, their eyes are more normally shaped, their features more closely resemble standard human anatomy. The show draws its regular Springfield residents with a fundamentally different visual language than it uses for outsiders. The conventional explanation is that it is just the art style. That yellow skin and bulging eyes are simply how The Simpsons looks, a visual shorthand that audiences accept without question. But consider the internal logic of the show itself. Within the world that Springfield inhabits, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live in this town and people who come from anywhere else. Outsiders look normal. Springfield residents look like something has happened to them. Something physical. Something biological. Even the animals are affected. The family dog, Santa's little helper, has the same bulging eye proportion as his owners. Blinky, the 3-eyed fish, is the most obvious example, but the show is populated with distorted wildlife throughout its run. The biological effects of the plant's contamination are not limited to humans. And the show tells you this explicitly. It shows you a 3-eyed fish and says, directly through its storyline, that the radiation from the power plant is doing this to living organisms. Then it presents 30 years of characters who display analogous mutations and expects the audience to chalk it up to animation style. Burns knows. The show makes this clear. The most vivid piece of evidence comes in the Season 8 episode called The Springfield Files. Homer is walking in the woods near Springfield when he encounters what he believes is an alien, a glowing, ethereal, slow-moving figure that does not look human. The town panics. FBI agents arrive. The episode builds toward a dramatic reveal, and when the truth comes out, the creature in the woods is not an alien, it is Mr. Burns. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with chemicals and radiation therapy, that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment keeps him functional for exactly 7 days. After each session, Burns wanders out of his facility in a dazed, disoriented state. His body glows. He stumbles through the dark woods like something out of a nightmare, and the people of Springfield see him and immediately conclude he must be from another planet. Not radiation, not the power plant they drive past every day. An alien. That detail captures something essential about Springfield. The contamination has been so present for so long, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that residents cannot recognize it even when it is glowing in front of them in the dark. In the Simpsons movie, The evidence escalates to federal level. Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a point so catastrophic that the Environmental Protection Agency determines the town must be physically sealed under a dome to prevent the pollution from spreading to the rest of the problems. Country. The United States government, a real functioning federal agency operating within the show's universe, looks at Springfield and concludes that the only solution is total containment. The town is classified as an environmental hazard, and the people inside it, the people who have been drinking that water and breathing that air for decades, are still inside when the dome goes up. Now think about what Burns' behavior across the series suggests about his awareness of all this. Burns funds private medical research. He has personal physicians on retainer. He undergoes weekly treatments specifically designed to manage the biological effects of chronic radiation exposure. Burns understands radiation in ways that nobody else in Springfield does, because his own body is dependent on managing radiation to survive. His facility has an entire pharmaceutical division. He knows exactly what his plant's emissions do to biological systems, because he has been studying and counteracting those effects in his own body for decades. Homer's continued employment makes more sense when viewed through this lens. When German investors briefly purchased the power plant, the very first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was hire engineers to assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code. The estimated cost nearly bankrupted them on the spot. They sold the plant back to Burns almost immediately, and Burns rehired Homer upon return. A competent safety inspector would identify the violations. A competent safety inspector would file reports. A competent safety inspector would, within a short period of time, trigger a shutdown of the facility that would expose everything Burns has done to this town for the past century. Homer Simpson, with a crayon in his brain and an IQ of 55, ensures that none of those reports are ever filed. Homer is not a mistake Burns tolerates. Homer is a feature Burns depends on. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. The population continues absorbing decades of low-level nuclear exposure. And the cognitive effects of that exposure ensure that the population cannot organize effectively to challenge the man responsible. It is a closed system. The poison creates the compliance that allows the poisoning to continue. The crayon in Homer's brain gets its own episode in season 12. Homer had the object removed, and the results were immediate. His IQ skyrocketed to genius level. He became articulate, perceptive, and capable of understanding the world around him with complete clarity for the first time in his adult life. He saw Springfield for what it was. He saw his job for what it was. He saw the architecture of his own situation laid out in front of him, and it was so unbearable that he chose to have the crayon reinserted. He chose to go back, but the show never asks the more unsettling question underneath that story. How did a crayon end up lodged in a child's brain in the first place? Homer grew up in Springfield. He attended Springfield schools. He was treated by Springfield doctors. He went through his entire childhood, adolescence, and adult life receiving medical care in a town with a functioning medical establishment, and not one physician ever discovered a foreign object inside his skull. Either the medical community in Springfield is comprehensively incompetent, or someone in Springfield's medical establishment knew that object was there and made a decision not to remove it. If Burns' influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a town he essentially owns, if the doctors are looking the other way while radiation erodes their patients' neurological function, then Homer's crayon is not a simple accident. It is something the show uses to gesture at a truth it cannot state directly. Something is wrong with the brains in Springfield. Something that keeps the population docile and incurious and unable to look up at those cracked cooling towers and ask the question that has been sitting in the air for 36 years. Why are we all like this? The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains all of them at once. The characters do not age because their mutated biology has been altered at the cellular level. The town resets after disasters because the population's memory function is compromised by chronic neurological damage. Homer survives fatal injuries because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that make him nearly indestructible, even as they devastate his cognition. Burns stays alive through treatments that would kill a normal person because he has been managing his own radiation exposure with resources that nobody else in Springfield can access. And nobody in Springfield questions any of it because the same contamination that changed their bodies also damaged the part of their minds responsible for critical thinking. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. It is a contamination zone. The residents are not eccentric, they are symptomatic, and the nuclear power plant that dominates their skyline, that provides their electricity, that employs their neighbors and poisons their water and quietly irradiates their children, is not a background gag. It is the cause. It has always been the cause. Every yellow face, every bulging eye, every impossible recovery, every forgotten disaster, every reset, it all traces back to the same cracked cooling towers, leaking the same invisible contamination into the same water supply, feeding the same damaged minds that have been staring at three-eyed fish for 30 years without once wondering what that means for them. The plant is not part of the show. The plant is the show. And nobody in Springfield will ever figure that out because the plant already made sure they couldn't. Before we move on, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There is so much more ahead. Section 2. Homer's Coma. The theory that reframes everything. Now that the radiation theory is sitting in your mind, I want to layer something on top of it. Something that does not cancel out what we just covered, but wraps around it and changes the shape of it entirely. Because what if everything we just described, the mutations, the contamination, the psychological damage, the town that cannot remember its own disasters is not the objective reality of Springfield at all? What if it is just the internal logic of a dream? The elaborate, slowly degrading simulation being run by the mind of a man who has been unconscious since 1993? This is the Homer coma theory. It is the single most popular, most debated, and most internally consistent fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons. And once you understand it, you cannot watch the show the same way again. Let's go back to the 1st of April, 1993. The 18th episode of Season 4 aired that night. Its title was, So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple. It was April Fool's Day, and Bart was playing a series of escalating pranks on Homer, each one larger than the last. The final prank involved Bart taking one of Homer's cans of beer to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker, vibrating the can until the pressure inside was extraordinary. Homer opened the can. The explosion was violent enough to send him to the hospital. While Homer was lying in his hospital bed, he noticed a vending machine on the other side of the room. He wanted a candy bar. He got up to retrieve one. The machine tipped forward under his weight, fell, and crushed him. Homer Simpson was put into a coma. A real one, not a cutaway gag, not a dream sequence the episode labels as such. A clinically unconscious state that the show plays completely straight. The episode ends with Homer's family gathered at his bedside. Bart tearfully confesses that the whole thing was his fault, that the April Fool's prank was what started everything. And Homer suddenly springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Everything returns to normal. The show tells you he woke up, but the show also tells you something else in those final moments. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5% permanently destroyed, never coming back. And Homer's response to being told he has suffered permanent brain damage is to laugh, even while admitting he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody in the room treats it as alarming. The episode ends. The Simpsons continues for 32 more years. Unless Homer never woke up at all. The theory was originally proposed on Reddit by a user whose handle was hard to pick a name. The core argument is straightforward. Homer did not wake up from his coma on the 1st of April 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date is a dream. Every storyline, every character development, every guest appearance, every impossible event is being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function, while his family sits beside him waiting for him to open his eyes. The evidence begins with tone. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Still a cartoon, still a comedy, but the storylines dealt with recognizable human problems. Homer tried to quit drinking. Marge considered an emotional affair with her bowling instructor. Lisa developed a crush on a substitute teacher who made her feel genuinely seen for the first time. Bart struggled academically and faced the real possibility of being held back a year, which was treated as a serious family crisis. The show's emotional center was built on relatable domestic anxiety, financial stress, marital tension, academic failure, the kind of situations real families actually navigate. After the coma, everything changes. The shift is not subtle. It is seismic. and it happens very quickly. Homer goes to space. He becomes the leader of a vigilante group. He joins a secret society. He discovers that his mother is a fugitive radical who has been living underground for decades. He meets God, twice, in face-to-face conversations. He travels to dozens of countries. He holds hundreds of different jobs across the course of the series, a new one seemingly every few episodes. He befriends an almost implausible number of celebrities. He survives physical trauma that would kill a trained military unit. The show transforms from a family sitcom grounded in economic anxiety to something approaching surrealist fantasy, and the escalation is so dramatic and so consistent that even viewers who have never heard of the coma theory have noticed it. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons started to decline for over 20 years. The coma theory argues that the answer is not a matter of quality, the answer is a matter of neurology. The Simpsons did not get worse after season 4. Homer's brain got worse. And as his brain deteriorated, so did the internal logic, the grounding, the emotional weight of the world his unconscious mind was generating. There is a detail 6 months before the coma that gives this theory an almost eerie quality. Season 4's premiere episode, Homer the Heretic, depicts Homer having an actual face-to-face conversation with God. A real conversation, complete with divine reasoning and theological discussion. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells him that Homer will eventually learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God says Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline matches exactly. God was telling Homer that his waking life was nearly over, that what was coming was something different from ordinary existence. 6 months after that conversation, Homer was crushed under a vending machine and slipped into unconsciousness. And within the logic of the coma theory, everything the show has presented since that moment is what God was referring to. Homer's time came, his waking life ended. What followed was the dream of a man who cannot let go. Now consider the aging problem, because the coma theory resolves it more elegantly than any other explanation in existence. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years, Lisa has been 8, Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not gained a wrinkle. The show uses a floating timeline where the present is always current and the characters never progress. Every other theory about Springfield attempts to explain this in its own way. The radiation theory proposes that mutated biology prevents normal cellular aging. The cartoon logic explanation says it is simply how animated shows work. These are both reasonable frameworks. But the coma theory has the simplest answer, and it is the one that, once you hear it, is very difficult to stop thinking about. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993 and never came back. Of course, his children do not grow up. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he was not conscious to witness it happen. His wife does not age because the last time he saw her clearly, she looked exactly as the show depicts her. His friends do not change because his memory of them was frozen at the moment the vending machine fell. Homer's coma dream preserves his world exactly as it was on the day he lost consciousness, because that is what extended unconscious states do to the mind. They lock you in place. They freeze your reference point. They give you the world as it was at the moment of loss, and they run it forward in loops, elaborating endlessly on that fixed foundation without ever allowing the fundamental reality to shift. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons make complete sense through this lens. Homer's unconscious mind, lying in a hospital bed, is receiving ambient sensory input, sounds from the television mounted on the wall, fragments of conversations between nurses and family members at his bedside, music from a radio somewhere down the hall, voices and names and cultural references drifting through the fog of unconsciousness, being absorbed by a brain that is still, somewhere in its depths, trying to make sense of the world. Those fragments become characters. Every celebrity who materializes in Springfield in the later seasons is a voice Homer heard through the haze, translated into a dream figure by a mind trying desperately to keep the simulation populated and alive. Springfield does not become a magnet for famous people because the plot demands it. Springfield absorbs famous people because Homer's dreaming brain keeps hearing them through the walls of the hospital and weaving them into the narrative it cannot stop generating. The show itself has acknowledged this theory, in the particular way that The Simpsons tends to acknowledge things it does not want to fully commit to. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene. In that scene, Homer wakes up from a long coma, and the reveal is explicit. Every outlandish episode has been a dream, exactly as the theory suggests. The showrunners confirmed that this was created as a direct reference to the fan theory. They animated it. They presented it to the audience. And then they stepped back and said it was a hoax. A fake scene planted by fictional hackers within the episode's story. The show took the theory all the way to an animated confirmation and then pulled the rug out. But they made it. They invested the time, the animation budget, the voice work, to create a scene in which Homer Simpson wakes up from a coma and the theory is proven correct, and then they wrapped that confirmation in a layer of deniability. They showed you the truth and told you it was a joke. And the audience laughed at the reveal that it was a fake, just as Homer laughed when he was told he had lost 5% of his brain. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory publicly in 2015. He said it was not true. He dismissed it as fan speculation. But what Al Jean did not address was why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift after season 4. He did not address why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He did not explain why the show becomes progressively more surreal and detached from physical reality with every passing season, which is exactly the pattern you would expect from a dream being generated by a brain that is slowly losing structural integrity. He said it was not true. The interviewer moved on. The fans did not. Because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever managed to do. It makes the show make sense. All of it, simultaneously. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the escalating cartoonishness of the plots, the consequence-free reset between episodes. The fact that Homer can survive anything, endure anything, walk away from anything, because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind cannot kill him, because his mind is the one telling the story. And here is the part of this theory that tends to stay with people long after they first encounter it. If the coma theory is true, then the emotional heart of The Simpsons is not a comedy. It is a tragedy, a quiet, sustained 30-year tragedy about a man who cannot let go. Homer's deepest wish is very simple. He wants his family. He wants Marge to love him. He wants Bart to still be small enough to cause trouble in a way that is ultimately harmless. He wants Lisa playing her saxophone in her room. He wants Maggie small enough to hold in one arm. He wants Friday evenings at the house on Evergreen Terrace, with the television on and the beer cold and the kids somewhere nearby being loud. That is all he wants. And in the coma, he gets it. The dream gives him everything. His children preserved exactly as he remembers them. His wife exactly as she was. His life exactly as he left it, frozen in amber at the last good moment before the vending machine fell. Homer's coma is not a nightmare. It is the only kind of heaven a man like Homer would ever think to ask for. A house where the kids are always young and the mortgage is always somehow paid and nothing ever ends and nobody ever has to say goodbye. And every time Homer survives something that should kill him, every time the world resets between episodes, every time the credits roll and everything returns to normal, it is not lazy writing. It is Homer's brain refusing to let the story stop. Because if the story stops, the dream stops. And if the dream stops, Homer has to find out what is waiting on the other side of it. How much time has passed, how old his children really are, whether Marge is still there, whether anyone is still sitting by his bed, or whether the room is finally empty and quiet and the choice to wake up is no longer available to him. That is the Homer coma theory. A man has been dreaming since April 1993. Every episode since is a letter from an unconscious father to the family he cannot reach. The show will never confirm it. It will never disprove it either, because the evidence is not hidden in trivia or Easter eggs. It is baked into the structure of the show itself, in the way nobody ages, in the way reality keeps getting stranger, in the way Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode, because in his dream, he never left. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? Close your eyes for a moment. We are going back to the summer of 1995. The Simpsons had never done anything like this before. No animated show had. The season 6 finale aired and ended on a cliffhanger that the network promoted like a national event. A genuine whodunit mystery, designed to be solved from clues embedded in the episode, accompanied by a national viewer contest in which the winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special, treating the fictional crime as if it were a real unsolved case. For an entire summer, millions of people debated, theorized, and argued about a single question. Who shot Mr. Burns? The answer the show eventually gave was Maggie. Baby Maggie Simpson. Case closed, they said. The baby did it. Move on. Except the case was never really closed. Because the more carefully you examine the evidence, the more the official answer starts to crack. Let's go back to the beginning of the mystery, because the motive situation in Springfield that summer was extraordinary. Burns had spent the entirety of Season 6's finale accumulating enemies with a thoroughness that bordered on performance. He had stolen an oil well discovered beneath the school grounds, gutting Springfield Elementary's budget and depriving the children of their programs. He had financially destroyed Moe's Tavern, a casual act of economic violence against a man whose bar was his entire identity. He had created a sinkhole that collapsed the Springfield Retirement Castle, displacing the town's elderly residents. He had injured Santa's little helper, the family dog, in an incident that managed to make it personal for the Simpsons specifically. And as his crowning act, he built a device to block the sun over the entire town, a giant mechanical disc designed to plunge Springfield into permanent shadow so that every resident would be forced to buy their electricity from his power plant. Burns literally stole the sun from his own community. When Smithers protested the sun blocker, Burns fired him on the spot. Smithers, the one person in Springfield who had devoted his entire existence to Burns's well-being, was dismissed without sentiment. By the end of Part 1, every single person in Springfield had a credible reason to want Charles Montgomery Burns dead. The show went out of its way to establish motives for an unusually wide range of characters. Homer, because Burns consistently failed to remember his name despite years of employment. Bart and Lisa, because of what the school lost. Grandpa Simpson, because of the retirement home. Groundskeeper Willie, because he lost his job. Tito Puente, because Burns cut the music program. Moe, because his bar went under. Smithers, freshly fired, spiraling, unmoored from the only purpose he had ever known. Every one of them was present at the town meeting where Burns collapsed. Multiple characters were carrying weapons. The tension in that meeting room was not vague or atmospheric. It was specific and directed, aimed at one man. Then Burns staggered, a gunshot wound. He stumbled to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on two letters. From the crowd's perspective, those letters were W and S. From Burns's own perspective, looking up from the ground, they were M and S. The ambulance came, the screen went dark, America went home and spent the summer arguing. When Part 2 aired in September, the investigation was played for comedy. Chief Wiggum fumbled through the evidence. Smithers confessed immediately, then watched his confession collapse. When it emerged, he had been blackout drunk during the relevant window and had actually discharged a firearm into the wooden leg of another character entirely. One by one, suspects were cleared. Principal Skinner had an alibi. Moe had an alibi. Tito Puente had perhaps the most memorable alibi in television history, a full musical number explaining he had channeled his rage into a samba. The investigation stalled until an eyelash was found on Burns's suit. DNA testing was conducted. The eyelash belonged to a Simpson. Homer had motive. Homer's fingerprints were on the weapon. Homer was arrested. Conviction seemed imminent. Then Burns woke from his coma. He identified his shooter. It was Maggie, he said. He had encountered her in the parking lot after the town meeting. He reached for her lollipop. His gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Mystery solved. Except no. Start with the contest itself. Fox invited viewers across the country to submit their guesses for the shooter. According to the DVD commentary for these episodes, when producers reviewed the sample of entries that were submitted, not a single person from the randomly selected group had guessed the correct answer. Nobody won. The prize was awarded randomly, and because the winner did not have the right answer, they received a cash payment instead of the promised animated appearance in the show. The producers did acknowledge awareness of one person who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup online on the night the original episode aired. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time the contest concluded, the account was no longer active. They could not be located. An open invitation for this person to come forward was included in the DVD release. As far as anyone has been able to determine, they never did. Think about what that means in practical terms. The show was promoted specifically as a solvable mystery. The creators told the audience that the clues were in part 1, that a careful viewer could identify the shooter from what was shown. And when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody in the viewing public had reached that conclusion from the available evidence. Either the clues were insufficient, or the red herrings were too effective, or the answer did not actually follow logically from the evidence in the way the show implied it would. Now look at the specific evidence that the show uses to support the Maggie conclusion. The sundial. Burns falls and his hands land on letters that spell M and S, which the show interprets as Maggie Simpson. But Burns himself, in his testimony, stated explicitly that his positioning on the sundial was not intentional. He did not deliberately arrange his hands to spell out his attacker's initials. He fell. He landed where he landed. The single most prominent piece of physical evidence in the entire mystery was acknowledged by the victim as coincidental: the gun. Burns was carrying a firearm in a holster, and the holster is shown empty before the shooting. The gun was already absent from his person when he walked out of the town meeting. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon. This eliminates a large category of suspects. The people who came to the meeting already armed with their own weapons were not the shooter. The shooter was someone who did not arrive planning to commit violence, who encountered Burns's gun by chance, and who used it in a moment of opportunity. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this description. So do a significant number of other characters. Burns's last words before being shot were, quote, "Oh, it's you." Not a scream, not a cry for help, not an expression of surprise or fear. A calm, almost casual acknowledgement of recognition, the way you might greet someone you have encountered before but do not consider a threat. Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? Has he ever had meaningful interaction with her prior to this episode? The show does not establish any history between Burns and Maggie. Burns barely registers Homer's name, and Homer has worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would see an infant and say, "Oh, it's you," the way you greet a familiar acquaintance, is difficult to reconcile with everything the show has established about his relationship with the Simpson family. In season 18, Homer makes a statement that the show treats as a throwaway line. He claims on camera that he was the one who shot Mr. Burns. He says this. Nobody in the scene responds to it. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the richest man in Springfield, and the narrative moves on as if he said nothing of consequence. Homer is a character who sometimes says things for attention that are not literally true. That is, established behavior. But it is also possible that the original verdict was wrong, and Homer made that confession because he knows something about what actually happened in that parking lot. One of the most compelling alternate theories to emerge from the fan community centers on Marge as the real shooter. The case is surprisingly strong. Marge is a devoted mother who watched Burns systematically destroy things her family cares about. The school her children attend lost its funding. Her family's dog was injured. The entire town was deprived of sunlight. Marge had motive. Marge was present. And Burns, as established in an earlier episode where he developed an infatuation with Marge while she briefly worked at the plant, had a personal history with her that Homer notably lacked. The theory proposes that Burns recognized Marge in the parking lot. That is what, "Oh, it's you" means. He saw the woman he had been infatuated with. He was not afraid. He greeted her. The shooting happened. And when Burns woke up from his coma and was asked to identify his attacker, he protected her. He pointed at the sundial. He let the investigation draw its own conclusions. Because the one thing Burns felt for Marge, that peculiar, distorted version of affection he had developed during her time at the plant, was enough to make him keep her name out of the official account. Maggie became the answer because Maggie was convenient. A baby cannot be prosecuted. Chief Wiggum says this explicitly. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie was the perfect outcome for someone who needed the case closed without the right person being identified. An infant too young to deny the charge, too young to understand what she was being accused of, too young to ever face any consequence for it. There is the final shot of the episode to consider. After everyone has left the room, Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully to confirm she is unobserved, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as confirmation. Maggie did it, and she knows she did it. But that same sequence of actions can be read entirely differently. A baby watching an adult commit a violent act and then imitating the motion later, alone, is precisely what babies do. They observe and they replay. They process through mimicry. Maggie is not confessing in that final shot. She is remembering. She saw someone shoot Mr. Burns, and she is replaying the motion because her developing mind is still processing what she witnessed. The alternate endings prove that even the writers were not fully committed to the Maggie resolution. A complete alternate conclusion was animated, fully voiced and produced, in which Smithers is revealed as the shooter. This ending was shown during the 138th episode Spectacular, where it was dismissed by the in-episode host on the grounds that all the DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which would be, quote, downright nutty. That line is a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which had concluded earlier that same year, in which a jury did in fact choose to disregard DNA evidence and return an acquittal. The show is winking. It is telling you that evidence can be pointed in whatever direction the people in power choose to aim it. A draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered this seriously enough to develop it before abandoning it. The answer was not determined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers ultimately chose. The mystery was reverse engineered, and the reverse engineering shows. And there is one question that the official resolution never addresses. In a town where every single resident had a motive, where dozens of people were present and many were visibly armed, where Burns had just committed an act of ecological warfare against the entire community by blocking out the sun, how is it possible that only one person acted? Springfield is not a town known for restraint. These people form mobs over minor disagreements. They have burned down buildings over misunderstandings. But when the richest man in their community literally steals sunlight from every living thing in their town, only one trigger gets pulled? Either Springfield's population is dramatically more restrained than every other episode suggests, or the shooting was not the spontaneous act of chance that the official story requires. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The show committed to it. The writers stand behind it. But the contest that nobody won, the clues that Burns himself called meaningless, the alternate endings that were fully produced, Homer's unaddressed confession in season 18, and the final shot of a baby alone in a room imitating a gunshot in private, all of it sits beneath the official verdict like a current running in a different direction. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was not solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, those are not the same thing. Section 4. How is Mr. Burns still alive? Let the mystery of the shooting sit for a moment. We will leave it open, the way Springfield leaves everything open, and move to the man at the center of it. Because there is a question about Charles Montgomery Burns that is arguably more disturbing than who shot him. And it is a question the show has been circling for its entire run without ever landing. How is this man still alive? This is not a rhetorical question. Within the established canon of The Simpsons, Burns is a medical impossibility. His age has been stated, implied, and occasionally contradicted across dozens of episodes, but every version of the timeline places his birth somewhere in the late 19th century. He has referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described first-hand involvement in events from the 1910s. He has spoken of working relationships with historical figures who died before most of the show's audience was born. By the most conservative estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By a more liberal reading of the show's internal chronology, he may be approaching 140, and he does not merely exist. He functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates municipal and state politics. He orchestrates long-term schemes that require sustained cognitive planning, an understanding of modern financial instruments, and a working knowledge of contemporary law. His physical body is frail, yes. He is easily blown over by a moderate breeze. His grip strength is approximately nothing, but his mind is razor-sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a consistent ruthlessness that nobody in the town can match, and he has been doing so for longer than any human being in the real world has ever maintained sustained consciousness. The show addresses his longevity directly in the Springfield Files. We discussed this episode in the context of the radiation theory, but it is worth revisiting because the implications for Burns specifically are significant. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so extreme in its nature that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. This treatment does not cure whatever is wrong with him. It manages it, keeps him functional, extends his viable window of operation by exactly 7 days. Without the treatment, he dies. The margin is not flexible. Miss one session, and the biological processes keeping Burns alive begin to fail within days. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine through scheduled, precise, recurring intervention. And the treatment itself involves radiation therapy. Of course it does. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, personally depends on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological function. Burns is not just profiting from radiation. He is powered by it. His body has been so fundamentally altered by a century of proximity to nuclear material that it cannot sustain normal cellular processes without external radiation input. The way a healthy body needs food and water, Burns's body needs its weekly dose. This creates a strange kind of symmetry. The contamination flowing from Burns's plant into Springfield's water and air is, at a lower and uncontrolled level, doing to the town's residents something related to what Burns's treatments are doing for him in a controlled and concentrated form. The population is receiving slow, diffuse, chronic radiation exposure. Burns is receiving precise, intensive, calibrated doses. The population is being damaged. Burns is being maintained. The difference is not in the substance. The difference is in the dosage, the control, and the resources available to manage the effects. There is a scene that has become one of the most quoted in the series, and it concerns Burns's immune system. A doctor examining Burns discovers that his patient has every disease known to medical science. Not a few, not many. Every single one simultaneously present in the same body at the same time. The doctor's explanation for why Burns is still standing is what he calls Three Stooges syndrome. Every disease in Burns's body is trying to kill him at once. And because they are all present simultaneously, they create a kind of biological gridlock. Each illness cancels out the others. They are all trying to advance through the same doorway at the same moment, and none of them can get through. Burns is the sickest man in the United States, the doctor concludes, but he is functionally indestructible because everything that should kill him is being held in place by everything else that should kill him. The scene is played for laughs. It always gets a response. But if you accept the radiation framework, it describes something more disturbing than a punchline. Burns's body is not maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural biological process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. The treatments do not cure the diseases because the diseases cannot be cured. They manage them. They keep every illness in a precise state of stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining the upper hand and completing its work. It is not medicine in any conventional sense. It is nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is effectively a reactor, and his weekly sessions are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. This explains Smithers in a way the show has never quite stated explicitly but consistently implies. Smithers is devoted to Burns. That devotion reads as a loyalty so total it approaches a kind of dependent love, and the show plays that dynamic for comedy across hundreds of episodes. But beneath the comedy is something the show drops hints about. Smithers manages Burns's schedule with an obsessiveness that goes beyond professional dedication. He ensures Burns makes every appointment. He monitors Burns's physical condition with a vigilance that never relaxes. And the show has established multiple times, across multiple episodes, that if Smithers were ever permanently removed from his position, Burns would be in genuine physical danger within a short time. Not emotional difficulty, physical danger. Without Smithers managing the treatment schedule, without Smithers ensuring the appointments are kept and the protocols followed, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium would collapse. Every illness in his body would surge forward at once, no longer held in check by the careful balance the treatments maintain. Smithers is not devoted to Burns purely out of something that resembles emotional attachment. Smithers is devoted because he understands, somewhere in his complete knowledge of Burns's medical situation, that his absence is a death sentence. He is keeping Burns alive through logistical precision, and that knowledge, that he is the single human being whose consistent presence stands between his employer and biological collapse, is the actual foundation of their relationship. Whatever else the show does with that dynamic, underneath it is this: Smithers has made himself irreplaceable in the most literal possible sense. Burns's connection to historical events across the show's history adds another layer to the immortality question. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, in a role the show suggests was morally complicated at best. He knew Howard Hughes personally. He references the Gilded Age not as history but as personal experience, the way you reference your childhood. He retained a $1 trillion bill that the United States government had entrusted to him during the war and simply kept it. The way you keep a receipt you forgot to return. For decades, his family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution, and the show has depicted the Burns family dynasty as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful lineages in American history. This raises a question the show deliberately refuses to engage with. Is Burns unique, or has his family always found mechanisms to extend their operational lifespan beyond natural limits? If the current Burns has been alive for well over a century through artificial means, what did previous generations of the Burns dynasty use before nuclear medicine existed? Before radiation therapy, before modern pharmaceutical intervention, before any of the technology that currently keeps Burns functional, were there earlier methods? Did the Burns family have access to something that allowed previous patriarchs to maintain their grip on power beyond what normal human lifespan permits? The show does not answer this, but it does establish that the Burns family has maintained continuous control of its fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity does not happen through normal generational succession. It requires either extraordinary luck across centuries, which is statistically implausible, or extraordinary measures, which seems much more consistent with everything the show has established about how the Burns family operates. Burns has come closer to dying more often than almost any other character in the series. He has been shot, he has been hospitalized repeatedly. He has collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been poisoned, been abandoned in the wilderness. And every time, he comes back. Not through the cartoon resilience that lets Homer bounce back from being hit by a car. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through money, through the medical systems his wealth has built and maintains, through the machinery of accumulated power that ensures, regardless of what happens to his physical form, there will always be someone standing by with the resources and the knowledge to restore him. Homer survives because the show needs him to survive. Burns survives because he spent a century building the systems that ensure his survival, and those systems do not need the show's intervention to function. They run themselves. Homer's immortality, in the coma theory's framing or the radiation theory's framing, is passive. It happens to him. Burns's immortality is engineered. Every dollar he has ever spent, every institution he has ever influenced, every physician he has ever retained, every compromise he has ever extracted from people who needed something from him, all of it serves one purpose. Keep the treatments coming. Keep the diseases balanced. Keep the reactor running. Because if Burns dies, the system he built is exposed. The empire requires its architect to remain present and functional, and the empire is very good at ensuring that he does. There is something almost poignant, in a bleak way, about the relationship between Burns and Springfield in this regard. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns's continued authority. Burns's continued existence depends on the treatments, which depend on the wealth, which depends on the plant. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which the man, the machine, and the money all feed each other endlessly. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot survive without Burns. And Burns cannot die because dying would mean the system he built finally has to face what it has done to the population it has maintained in a state of irradiated compliance for over 100 years. Mr. Burns is the oldest man in Springfield. He may be the oldest man in America. He is sustained by weekly radiation treatments, protected by a fortune that predates the nation itself, kept on schedule by an assistant whose devotion is functionally indistinguishable from a medical requirement, and surrounded by a population too neurologically compromised to ask why their employer glows faintly in the dark and has personal memories of the Spanish-American War. He is not immortal. He is something worse than immortal. He is too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if his treatment schedule holds and his infrastructure remains intact, could be for a very long time indeed. Section 5. The Principal and the Pauper Springfield's Machinery of Denial. Rest your eyes if you want. The voice will keep going. We are going somewhere slightly darker now, to an episode that the fan community has argued about for almost 30 years. Not because of what it revealed about a character, but because of what it revealed about the entire town. This is the story of an episode that fans called the worst in the series, a betrayal of everything The Simpsons stood for, the story of an episode that broke the show's continuity and disrespected its own history. Except I want to offer a different reading tonight, because I think this episode did not break The Simpsons. I think it diagnosed Springfield. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper. The 28th of September, 1997. The episode begins at Springfield Elementary, where the school is holding a ceremony honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the community. It is a warm occasion. Skinner is a character the show has developed across 8 seasons. His complicated relationship with his domineering mother Agnes, his uneasy authority over Bart Simpson, his quiet dignity under difficult circumstances, all of it built up across hundreds of appearances. Skinner feels like a known quantity. Then a stranger walks through the door. A man nobody recognizes introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who had been captured as a prisoner of war, presumed killed in Southeast Asia, and who had survived, who had escaped, who had finally found his way home to Springfield after decades, only to discover that someone else had been living his life in his absence. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner for 20 years is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street kid, a petty criminal from a bad background with no particular future and no identity worth protecting. He was drafted into the military, found himself serving alongside the real Seymour Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. But Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. She was a grieving mother who had just lost her child. And here was a young man standing at her door who had known Seymour, who had served with him, who carried something of him back. Agnes needed someone to be there. And Armin Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a home or a family or a reason to be somewhere, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the life, the mother, and he maintained the fiction for 20 years until the real man walked back through the door and the entire structure collapsed. Now, here is where Springfield does something extraordinary. The town holds a meeting. Both men are present. The truth is fully established and known to everyone in the room. The real Seymour Skinner is standing there. Armin Tamzarian's deception is completely exposed. Every person in Springfield knows that their principal, the man who has been running their children's school and participating in their community for 2 decades, is not who he claims to be. And the town votes, not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian for the fraud, not on how to make the real Skinner whole. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The vote is unanimous. They choose the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree that the imposter is henceforth the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his identity stolen, is physically removed from Springfield. He is tied to a railroad car and expelled from the community, and the judge makes it explicitly illegal under penalty of torture to ever mention the truth again. Let that settle. A town collectively decided that their comfort mattered more than the truth. They had definitive proof that a major public figure in their community had been living a stolen identity. They had the actual victim of the fraud standing in front of them, and they voted to keep the fiction. They sentenced the truth to exile and made speaking it a criminal act. Fans were furious. The criticism was swift and sustained. Harry Shearer, who voices both Skinner and Burns, publicly stated his objections to the storyline. Critics argued that the episode retroactively invalidated everything that had ever been established about Skinner's character. His military service was built on a lie. His relationship with Agnes was a performance. His entire dynamic with Bart and the rest of Springfield was a fiction. The episode is consistently ranked among the worst in the series, cited as evidence that the writers had stopped respecting their own creation. But here is the interpretation that nobody wants to sit with. The episode is not a betrayal of what The Simpsons is. It is the most honest thing the show has ever said about Springfield. Because Springfield has always worked this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed, through some collective unspoken process, to forget what does not fit the narrative it needs to maintain. The principal and the pauper did not introduce this behavior. It put it on screen in explicit, visible procedural form. It showed you the meeting. It showed you the vote. It showed you the legal mechanism. It showed you the literal expulsion of truth from the community. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe, ignores a contradiction, or resets to normal after something world-altering happens, The forgetting occurs off-screen. You cut from the disaster to the next episode and everything is fine, and the show trusts you not to ask why. The Principal and the Pauper is the one time the show let you watch the forgetting happen in real time. It showed you the machinery. Consider how many times Springfield has experienced events that should permanently alter its reality. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It has survived multiple nuclear near misses. It has been invaded. It has experienced environmental catastrophes, alien encounters, literal solar blockage by a billionaire, and every time, without exception, the next episode finds everything back to normal. Nobody references the previous disaster. The slate is clean. The fan community calls this episodic storytelling. The coma theory calls it a dreaming brain resetting between cycles. The radiation theory calls it cognitive damage from chronic nuclear exposure. But the Principal and the Pauper offers a fourth explanation that does not require supernatural mutation or unconscious dreaming. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset. Collectively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract that operates below the level of conscious decision but surfaces, when necessary, in a town meeting and a judge's decree. We will not acknowledge what happened. We will treat the agreed-upon version of reality as the only version. We will treat the truth as criminal, and anyone who insists on the truth, anyone who refuses to accept the agreed-upon version and keeps pulling at the threads, will be removed from the community. That is not a cartoon trope. That is how real communities work. Small towns in particular carry a capacity for collective denial that is rarely discussed but very well documented. Scandals get managed, crimes become rumors that eventually stop being spoken about. Uncomfortable truths get revised until the revision has been told so many times that it becomes the only version anyone remembers. The person who keeps insisting on the original version is the one who gets labeled difficult, unstable, a troublemaker. The person who accepts the revision, who adapts to the agreed-upon narrative, gets to stay. The Principal and the Pauper did not break the Simpsons. It diagnosed Springfield. It showed you that the town's collective amnesia is not a glitch in the storytelling. It is a feature. It is a defensive mechanism operated by a population that cannot afford to confront the reality of their situation, because confronting it means admitting things that would unravel everything. If they remembered the dome, they would have to acknowledge the pollution. If they acknowledged the pollution, they would have to confront the power plant. If they confronted the power plant, they would have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns, the economy would collapse. If the economy collapsed, the town would die. The denial is not irrational. The denial is the only sustainable response to living in Springfield. So they vote to forget. They make forgetting the law. And anyone who remembers too much, who insists on the truth past the point where insisting is comfortable, gets tied to a train. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He arrived with proof that the official narrative was a fiction. He was a man whose entire identity had been erased by the community without his knowledge or consent. He was asking for nothing more than to be recognized as real. And the town's response was to legally define him as non-existent and physically remove him from the premises. That is not a comedy beat. That is the show telling you exactly how Springfield maintains its impossible reality. Through consensus. Through the systematic management of inconvenient truths. Through the expulsion of anyone who makes the lie too difficult to sustain. The Coma Divided gives this episode an additional layer of meaning. If everything since Season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire town votes to sustain a stolen identity because Homer needs to believe that lies can be made permanent through collective agreement. He needs to believe that a fake version of a life can become real if enough people agree to treat it as real. He needs to believe that the dream he is living can stand in for the actual life he is no longer living, and that nobody who matters will ever call the difference. Because Homer's coma is exactly that, a borrowed identity, a life that keeps running in the absence of the person it belongs to. And as long as the dream town of Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction, the whole structure holds. The Principal and the Pauper is the most important episode The Simpsons ever produced, not in spite of being widely disliked, but partly because of it. It showed the audience something true about the show and the community it depicts, and the audience rejected it. The audience voted, in their own way, to maintain the comfortable version of Springfield, just like the town did. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is somewhere out there, tied to a railcar, exiled from his own name. The last honest man in a town that made honesty a criminal offense. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the silent genius. She doesn't talk. She barely walks without falling. She communicates through pacifier movements and the occasional pointed look. She is 1 year old, and she has been 1 year old for 36 years. And in that time, without saying a single word that the show counts as part of the permanent record, she has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire. She led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker. She has saved her family from life-threatening situations on multiple occasions. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that would be remarkable in a competent adult, coming from a baby who cannot yet form sentences. She has been tested and found to possess intelligence that standardized assessments struggle to measure. And through all of it, through every remarkable thing she has ever done, she says nothing. She maintains her silence, completely, deliberately, over 3.5 decades. The question worth sitting with tonight is not whether Maggie is unusually intelligent. The show establishes that fairly clearly. The question is why she chooses not to let anyone know. Let's start with the shooting, because it is the act that defines her in the public imagination, even though it may actually be the least interesting thing about her. We have already examined the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery and the problems with the official account. But whether or not Maggie intentionally pulled that trigger, the aftermath tells you something about who she is. A baby was identified as the person who shot the richest man in Springfield. The police investigated. The evidence was examined. The official conclusion was that an infant had committed an act of violence against a powerful adult, and the legal response was that nothing could be done about it. No jury would convict a baby, as Chief Wiggum noted. Case closed. But look at what Maggie does in the final shot of that episode. Everyone has left the room. She is alone. She looks around, carefully, deliberately, checking that no one is watching. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that imitates pulling a trigger. That sequence of actions is not reflexive. A baby does not randomly check the room for witnesses before performing a motion. That is a demonstration of situational awareness. She knew that performing that gesture in front of others would have consequences, so she waited until she was unobserved. The checking of the room before the gesture requires a theory of mind, an understanding that other people have awareness of her and that she can be seen. The decision to wait until alone requires impulse control and planning ahead. These are not traits associated with typical infant cognition. These are traits associated with someone who understands exactly what they are doing and has decided, consciously, that secrecy is the optimal strategy. Maggie understood that she had done something significant. She understood that demonstrating awareness of that significance in front of witnesses would be unwise. So she performed her private acknowledgement of it alone, in an empty room, when no one could see. A 1-year-old. Then there is The Longest Daycare. This is a theatrical short film released in 2012, screened in cinemas before an animated feature. It was nominated for an Academy Award. It is 7 minutes long, and it is 7 minutes of Maggie Simpson demonstrating a level of intelligence, planning capacity, and adaptive problem-solving that most adults would find challenging. The premise involves Maggie being dropped off at a daycare center run with authoritarian efficiency. Inside the facility, Maggie encounters a caterpillar about to enter its chrysalis. She wants to protect it. Another baby, a recurring bully named Gerald, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action sequence in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, circumvents the facility's authority structure, and navigates the physical environment of the daycare to save the caterpillar and release the eventual butterfly safely. She does all of this without speaking. She reads the environment with systematic attention. She identifies threats and assigns them priority. She develops strategies and adapts them when they fail. She executes plans that require precise timing, spatial reasoning, and the ability to predict other people's behavior and use those predictions to her advantage. Her body cannot keep pace with her mind. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls in situations where running would serve her better. But every decision she makes is correct. Every tactical choice she makes is optimized for the outcome she is pursuing. Her cognitive processing compensates entirely for every physical limitation her development imposes. She wins because she is thinking more clearly and more precisely than anyone else in the room. The show has tested Maggie's intelligence directly in various episodes. The results are always presented quickly and then moved past, as if the show itself is not quite comfortable with how clearly they point. But the pattern that emerges across multiple instances is consistent. Maggie's intelligence registers as extraordinary, as something that falls outside what standard assessments are designed to measure, and the family consistently fails to register this, because they are too occupied with their own dramas and disasters to pay sustained attention to the baby in the background who is quietly handling everything. And that is the key. The word that keeps coming up when you trace Maggie through the series. Quietly. Maggie's defining characteristic is her silence, not her intelligence. The intelligence is remarkable. The silence is the choice. Her first word, spoken once and never repeated, was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in what amounted to a significant casting decision for a single syllable. The word was daddy. It happened in one episode. Maggie has spent 36 years since that moment, declining to add to the record. She is surrounded by a family of extremely verbal people. Homer narrates his own experience. Marge processes everything aloud. Bart provokes and performs. Lisa lectures and advocates and argues. The Simpson household produces an almost constant stream of spoken words, and in the middle of it, Maggie sits and watches. The theory that has accumulated around Maggie's silence in the fan community is worth considering carefully. It proposes that the silence is not a developmental delay. It is a strategic decision made by a mind intelligent enough to understand the value of not being noticed. Look at what happens to intelligent women in this family. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. Her intelligence is consistently established as the highest in the household, and likely among the highest in Springfield. And what has that intelligence given her? Isolation? Mockery. Being dismissed and condescended to by teachers, peers, and authority figures who find her threatening. Lisa speaks up and gets talked over. She challenges authority and gets punished for the challenge. She tries to improve things around her and encounters resistance from a community that does not want to be improved. Her intelligence is her most defining trait and her greatest social liability, because she displays it visibly and constantly. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room, and the room responds by making her feel it. Maggie has been watching this happen since she was born. She observed her brilliant sister fight every day for recognition and receive in return, at best, brief acknowledgement before being dismissed again. She watched the most intellectually capable person in the family be consistently undervalued and overlooked by a household and a community that rewards loudness and familiarity over genuine insight. And Maggie drew a conclusion. Not the conclusion Lisa drew, which was to keep fighting regardless of the cost, which is admirable and also expensive and mostly unrewarded. Maggie drew the opposite conclusion. Silence is power. Invisibility is protection. The less attention you attract, the more you can accomplish. The more you appear to be exactly what everyone expects a baby to be, the less anyone will think to watch what you are actually doing. Every time Maggie does something remarkable, the pattern is the same. The family does not notice. The community does not notice. The incident registers briefly and then is absorbed back into Springfield's collective capacity for forgetting. Burns was shot, and the investigation focused on everyone except the baby, because who seriously suspects a baby? The daycare rebellion she organized succeeded in part because nobody monitors infants carefully enough to notice them organizing. Every heroic act Maggie performs, every display of remarkable capability, happens in the margins, in the spaces where nobody is paying enough attention to see it, and Maggie ensures that those spaces remain available by maintaining the most effective disguise imaginable. She performs infancy. She mimics helplessness. She presents as exactly what a 1-year-old is expected to be, passive and dependent and unremarkable. And the performance is so complete and so sustained that it works on everyone around her indefinitely. Connect this to the radiation theory, and you get something interesting. If the contaminated environment of Springfield produces mutations, and if those mutations affect each individual differently based on their particular biology, then Homer and Maggie represent two extremes of the same radioactive spectrum. Homer's exposure reduced his cognitive function to a clinical disability. Maggie's exposure amplified hers to a level that resists measurement. Same environment, same family, same contaminated water and irradiated air, opposite results. Homer is what happens when radiation takes something away. Maggie is what happens when it gives something that was not there before, or amplifies something that was only beginning. They are, in the show's internal biology, two sides of the same coin. If the coma theory is true, Maggie's brilliance takes on a different meaning entirely. one that is worth sitting with for a moment. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode is the product of a mind desperately trying to hold on to its family, then Maggie's extraordinary intelligence is Homer's deepest wish for his youngest child. He cannot watch her grow up. He cannot hear her speak past that first word, because she had only said it once before the vending machine fell. He cannot see what kind of person she is becoming. He cannot protect her from a world that he is not conscious to inhabit. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her intelligence that transcends her physical development. He makes her capable of things that no baby in reality could accomplish. He makes her safe, not through his protection, because he cannot protect her from where he is, but through her own capability. He dreams her as someone who does not need him to protect her, because she is more than capable of protecting herself. Maggie's genius, in the coma reading, is a father's prayer disguised as a character trait. But the darker reading, the one that sits in waking Springfield rather than in Homer's unconscious, is worth considering too. Maggie does not speak because she has learned that speaking gets you nothing in this town. She does not reveal her intelligence because intelligence is a liability in Springfield. She watches everything. She remembers everything. She processes everything. She waits. For what? The show has never said. Maggie's endgame is the last truly unresolved mystery of the Simpson family. She is the only character whose full capability remains unknown, because the show has never committed to a moment where Maggie finally reveals what she has been carrying behind that pacifier for 36 years. We have seen glimpses. We have seen her shoot a man. We have seen her command a room full of babies with silent authority. We have seen her solve problems that stump adults, navigate physical environments that should be beyond her, and make decisions in crisis that demonstrate a clarity of mind that nobody around her suspects she possesses. The family trusts her judgment in moments where it matters, implicitly, without being able to explain why. As if some part of them recognizes, below the level of conscious thought, that the baby watching everything from her spot on the living room floor is seeing more clearly than any of them. Maggie is 1 year old. She cannot walk reliably. She cannot speak in full sentences. She has been maintaining this performance for 36 years. And she is the most capable person on Evergreen Terrace. She has simply decided that nobody needs to know that yet. And maybe that is the thing about Maggie that stays with you longest. Not what she has done, what she is waiting to do. Behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes, behind 3.5 decades of deliberate and sustained silence, something is thinking, something is planning. Something is watching the family and the town and the world around it with an intelligence that nobody suspects and nobody can contain. When Maggie finally decides to act, when she finally breaks her silence and shows Springfield what has been behind that blank baby expression for all this time, the town will not see it coming. That is exactly how she designed it. Section 7. The predictions, how they actually did it. The room is dark and quiet, and we are going to talk about the thing that makes people stop mid-scroll and stare at their phones. The thing that has given The Simpsons more cultural visibility in the 2020s than it probably had during the peak years of its critical acclaim. The predictions. The idea that a cartoon sitcom from 1989 has been accurately forecasting major world events for over 3 decades. That a television show created by a team of comedy writers in Hollywood has somehow produced content that aligns with future reality with a consistency that feels, to many people who encounter it, like something beyond coincidence. Let's get the well-known ones out of the way first, because you have probably seen them. In the year 2000, a season 11 episode called Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson becomes the first female president of the United States. In that episode, Lisa's predecessor in the Oval Office is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 election. The show presented a Trump presidency as a satirical joke about the direction celebrity culture and American politics were heading. And then American politics headed exactly in that direction. Screenshots from the episode circulated everywhere. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted Trump" became a cultural meme that reached people who had not actively watched the show in years. The list continues. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a wristwatch device that communicates and displays information in ways that closely mirror what a modern smartwatch does. In a 1994 episode, Homer travels to space with Buzz Aldrin, decades before private space tourism began to feel like a plausible near-term reality. In a 1998 episode, Homer encounters a mathematical equation on a chalkboard that appears to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was not experimentally confirmed until 2012 at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes a theory about the shape of the universe, suggesting it might be toroidal, donut-shaped, and years later cosmologists analyzing cosmic microwave background radiation found patterns that some researchers interpreted as consistent with a torus-shaped universe. In a 1993 episode called Margin Chains, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield and triggers mass panic, panic buying, and a frantic search for treatment. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. During the chaos of that fictional outbreak, the town accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which resonated in a particularly odd way when Asian giant hornets, labeled murder hornets by American media, were discovered in the United States during the actual 2020 pandemic. In 1996, a Simpsons episode featured a joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra for the same show while under the influence of various substances. That exact collaboration, Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra, actually happened in 2024 at the Royal Albert Hall, 28 years between the joke and the event. In a 1998 episode, the show depicted Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox, which became reality in 2019. Across multiple episodes, spread across multiple decades, the show depicted video calling technology, autocorrect failures in text messaging, and a pervasive culture of digital surveillance, all of them normalized in the show's universe, well before they became defining features of everyday contemporary life. The list is long enough to fill its own dedicated video, which it has, many times. Every time a new alignment appears between the show's past content and present reality, the internet responds with the same mixture of amazement and suspicion. How did they know? Are the writers working from some kind of advance information? Is The Simpsons operating as a prophetic text embedded inside a comedy format? The answer from the people who actually make the show is much less dramatic. Al Jean, who has been executive producer since the show's earliest seasons, has addressed the phenomenon directly, and his explanation is, by his own description, not very exciting. If you throw enough darts, some of them will hit. That is essentially his position. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, observations, satirical references, and speculation about the future of American culture, technology, politics, and society. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, some portion of it will align with future events through statistical probability alone. Producer Bill Oakley, who was a showrunner during several of the show's most celebrated seasons, was even more direct. There are very few cases where The Simpsons predicted something, he said. It is mainly coincidence, because the episodes are so old that history repeats itself. Both men were asked about this multiple times as the phenomenon grew in the social media era, and both gave versions of the same answer. Organizations that fact-check viral claims have examined many of the most widely shared prediction stories and found that the majority of them have much simpler explanations than prophecy. The show's enormous output creates a large number of opportunities for coincidences to emerge. Most of the supposed predictions are based on trends that were already clearly visible when the episodes were written. The Trump prediction did not materialize from nowhere. Trump had been publicly discussing the possibility of running for president since at least the late 1980s. He was a constant presence in American media throughout the 1990s, regularly discussed in the context of celebrity culture and political ambition. The writers of that 2000 episode were not predicting the future. They were taking a trend that was already in motion and pushing it to what seemed, at the time, like an absurd extreme. The Disney-Fox prediction is similar. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Corporations were absorbing their competitors at an increasing rate. The joke was not a forecast. It was a satirical observation about a direction that was already clearly underway. The smartwatch was an extrapolation. Technology had been shrinking and becoming more personal throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. Imagining a wrist-mounted computer that connected to communication networks was not a leap of inspiration. It was the logical extension of a trend anyone paying attention could identify. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most academically credentialed in television. Multiple writers hold advanced degrees from Ivy League and elite universities. Many have academic backgrounds in mathematics, science, economics, computer science, and political theory. These are not people making random guesses. They are highly educated, carefully attentive observers of American culture who spend their professional lives studying systems, identifying patterns, and extrapolating existing trajectories to their logical conclusions. The predictions are not supernatural. They are the output of rigorous pattern recognition applied with a satirical frame. And there is confirmation bias to account for. The Simpsons has also made countless predictions that did not come true. Jokes about jetpacks becoming standard personal transportation, scenarios involving moon colonies and Mars settlements, political outcomes that went the other direction entirely, technologies that never materialized in the forms the show imagined, cultural shifts that turned out differently than the satire suggested. Nobody shares those. Nobody builds threads about the episode from 2001 that predicted something that never happened. The failures dissolve into the background noise of a long show's history, and the hits get screenshotted and shared and added to a cumulative highlight reel that, in isolation from the misses, looks like something beyond coincidence. Confirmation bias does not just mean you notice the things that confirm your belief and ignore the things that challenge it. It means the information ecosystem around you does the same thing on your behalf. The internet has an enormous appetite for alignments between past entertainment and present events. That appetite generates enormous engagement with the clips and screenshots that fit the narrative, which means those clips and screenshots spread widely, which means more people see them, which means more people are looking for new examples. The mechanism is self-reinforcing. All of that is the rational, well-supported explanation. And it is correct, but it is not entirely complete, because while the debunking accounts for most of the predictions cleanly and convincingly, there are a few that resist the standard explanation more than the others. The Trump prediction did not just identify a celebrity who might run for president. It specified Trump by name and depicted him descending an escalator in a sequence that has a visual resemblance to the actual announcement he made in 2015. The level of specificity there is unusual. An episode involving Siegfried and Roy depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers. In 2003, Roy Horn was critically and nearly fatally injured when one of the act's white tigers bit him during a performance. The specific detail of the white tiger is precise enough that statistical probability becomes a slightly less comfortable explanation. These are not the broad trend extrapolations that account for most of the list. These are specific details that align with future events in ways that give you pause for a moment, even after you have accepted the rational framework. This is where the meta-theory becomes more interesting than any individual prediction. The most compelling explanation for the Simpsons prediction phenomenon is not that the writers have access to future information or that they are operating from some template for how history unfolds. It is that the Simpsons does not predict the future. It shapes the future through cultural influence on a scale that is difficult to fully appreciate from the inside. The Simpsons is one of the most pervasive, most deeply embedded pieces of American media in history. It has been running for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have become vocabulary. Its observations have become part of the shared language through which Americans understand and discuss their own culture. When the show makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream of millions of people. It becomes a reference. It becomes something people say when his name comes up. It normalizes the idea in a particular way, makes it feel less like an impossibility and more like a punchline waiting for its setup. The show does not predict the Disney-Fox merger. It makes media consolidation feel so inevitable, so already in progress, that when the actual merger happens, the cultural response is not shock. It is recognition. Of course this happened. It was already the joke. The show's satire does not forecast the future. It primes the cultural imagination for outcomes that are already in motion. And when those outcomes arrive, the audience experiences something that feels like prediction, but is actually the result of having been culturally prepared to receive those events as familiar rather than surprising. Springfield does not reflect America. In some meaningful sense, America has spent 36 years becoming Springfield. The show held up a mirror, and the audience stared into it so long that they started to resemble what they saw. The corrupt local government, the polluting billionaire, the population too distracted and too cognitively overloaded to effectively challenge the systems exploiting them, the endless cycle of catastrophe and reset. the collective amnesia that enables the same mistakes again and again. Springfield was not a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield was a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first. And the final, genuinely interesting piece of the prediction phenomenon, even knowing how the mechanism works, even understanding the confirmation bias and the volume and the cultural influence and the pattern recognition behind the educated writer's extrapolations, even knowing all of that, it is still something to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about the shape of American life, and enough of them have aligned closely enough with subsequent reality that even the show's own creators occasionally pause and wonder if they know something they should not. The predictions are not supernatural, but they are something. They are what happens when you spend 36 years paying very close attention to the patterns and how the world works, writing those patterns down in comic form, and then waiting to see which ones the world catches up to. Section 8. Mona Simpson and the conspiracy that spans 3 generations. We have been in Springfield for a while now. The room is probably quiet around you, and the thoughts are settling in slowly the way they do late at night. This next part is about a character who barely appears in the show, a woman who is absent from the vast majority of its run, whose presence is felt more in her absence than in anything she ever says directly. Mona Simpson, Homer's mother. The most important character in the history of The Simpsons, measured not by screen time but by consequence. For the first 6 seasons of the show, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told him she passed away when Homer was young. Abe had a grave to show him. Homer mourned appropriately. He grew up believing he was a boy whose mother died early and whose father was too emotionally distant and erratic to fill the space she left. That belief shaped Homer comprehensively. His desperate need to be loved, his tendency toward clinginess, his terror of abandonment, which runs like a fault line beneath almost everything he does, his willingness to endure humiliation from his employer, from his neighbors, from his family, rather than risk losing the stability he has, his compulsive need to be liked by everyone around him, which coexists in strange tension with his frequent obliviousness to other people's feelings. Homer's entire personality is, at its foundation, a set of coping mechanisms built around maternal loss, the hole left by a mother who was not there. In Season 7, the show revealed that the hole was manufactured. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November 1995. The setup involves Homer faking his death to avoid working on a weekend, a piece of typical Simpsons comedy infrastructure. But when Marge insists he correct the administrative error his fake death has created, Homer visits the Hall of Records and discovers something that reorients his entire understanding of his own history. According to the official municipal records, his mother is alive. The grave Abe had shown him was not his mother's grave at all. It was the grave of Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been using a famous American writer's headstone as a stand-in for his wife's for the entirety of Homer's life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She is mourning him. She does not immediately recognize the man standing in front of her because she last saw him as a child, and time has changed him beyond her ability to reconcile the memory with the reality. But when Homer proves who he is, the reunion that follows is one of the most genuinely affecting scenes the show has ever produced. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona explains. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving her son. She left because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. She was forced underground, and the person who put her there was Charles Montgomery Burns. The backstory goes to 1969. Mona was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. Ordinary, quiet, living a small life in Springfield while the world outside was burning with political upheaval. Then something changed. Mona was radicalized. The show depicts this with a mix of comedy and genuine emotional weight, as it tends to do with material that it takes seriously. She joined a group of activists, and that group of activists targeted a facility owned by Burns, a biological weapons laboratory. That detail is worth pausing on. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant, he owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory designed to produce weaponized biological agents, operating inside the town of Springfield, the same community where Homer was growing up, where children were attending school, where families were living their daily lives without any awareness that the richest man in town was also manufacturing weapons-grade pathogens in a lab nearby. Mona and her group broke into the facility. They deployed what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agent stored inside. The raid was operationally successful, and during the chaos of the break-in, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be a young Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. A minor narrative thread that connects the conspiracy to the present day of Springfield more deeply than it initially appears. But Mona made a mistake in the moments after the raid. As her group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. That someone was Mr. Burns. She stopped to assist the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. From that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She could not return home. She could not contact her family. She could not hold her son or explain to him what was happening and why she was leaving. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was asleep and disappeared into the night, beginning a 27-year period underground, living under assumed identities, always moving, never able to stop. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. He grew up believing she was dead. He grew up believing he was the kind of son whose mother would rather die than raise. And that belief shaped everything that followed. Now here is where the conspiracy takes its full shape, because Burns did not simply report Mona and move on. Burns pursued her, actively and over decades. He retained a personal grudge against a woman who had destroyed his biological weapons program, and he used his resources to ensure she could never resurface safely. This is not speculation within the show's narrative. When Mona finally returns to Springfield in that Season 7 episode, Burns spots her through the window of a cab almost immediately. He recognizes her without hesitation. He contacts the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to run again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time in his life, this time understanding exactly why. And this time he knows who made it necessary. The man who destroyed his family is his employer. Homer works for Burns. Homer has worked for Burns his entire adult life. Homer earns his paycheck, his health care, his sense of occupational identity from the man who forced his mother underground when Homer was a child and spent the next several decades ensuring she could never come back. The show does not play Homer's failure to connect these dots for laughs. It plays it as tragedy, because Homer Simpson is not capable of making that kind of connection. The crayon, the radiation, decades of cognitive erosion from living in Springfield's contaminated environment. Homer is too cognitively impaired to build the chain of causation that would allow him to understand the architecture of his own suffering. He knows Burns persecuted his mother. He knows Burns is his employer. He cannot make those two facts mean what they should mean together. He cannot make the leap from those data points to the conclusion that his entire life, his relationship with work, his sense of self, his emotional damage, his compulsive need for approval from authority figures who treat him with contempt, all of it was engineered by one man's decision to pursue a grudge against a woman who made him feel powerless for one afternoon in 1969. This is the conspiracy laid out in full. By driving Mona away when Homer was still very young, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged in very specific ways. He would grow up desperate for approval. He would grow up incapable of challenging authority in any meaningful way, because authority figures are what he has always needed to be loved by. He would grow up with a terror of abandonment that makes him cling to stability even when that stability is clearly harming him. He would grow up, in other words, as exactly the kind of person Burns needs in Sector 7G. Not just a compliant employee, a broken one. A man whose psychological damage ensures he will not quit, will not organize, will not challenge, will not ever look at what is happening around him and demand something different. Homer works at the power plant because Burns broke him as a child. And the broken version of Homer is precisely the version Burns requires. The show confirms this architecture with one more detail. At some point in the series, it is revealed that Grandpa Simpson struck a deal with Burns. Grandpa had discovered something Burns did, some act or crime that would have been damaging if exposed. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would have employment at the plant indefinitely, no matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how clearly he was failing his job description, no matter how many times dismissal would have been the logical response. Homer's position was protected by a private arrangement between his father and his mother's persecutor, brokered in secret, never disclosed to Homer, and never explained in terms he could understand. Homer's job security was not cartoon convenience. It was a contract, a deal made in silence, maintained in secret, designed to keep a damaged man in a job that serves the man who damaged him. 3 generations of the Simpson family, broken by one billionaire's grudge. Mona fought back against Burns and lost 27 years with her son. Abe made a deal with the enemy to protect himself and covered the truth with a poet's gravestone. Homer inherited the consequences of both choices without understanding either of them, and spent his adult life working for the man at the center of both. Mona died in a later season. The show treated her death without the comedy architecture it uses for almost everything else. Homer sat beside her. He held her hand. He watched his mother, who he had barely known, slip away quietly, and the weight of 27 stolen years pressed down on the scene without any softening. No joke, no cutaway, no reset at the end of the episode. Just a man and his mother, and the time that was taken from them. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But underneath the comedy, underneath 36 seasons of Homer falling and recovering and stumbling forward, there is a story about a family that was systematically dismantled by one man's power and one town's incapacity to resist it. Mona fought and lost everything. Abe made his deal with the devil and buried the evidence. Homer inherited the consequences and spent his life unable to understand why everything felt so heavy. Burns won. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the resources writes the rules, and the rules ensure that Homer Simpson will keep showing up to Sector 7G every morning for as long as the plant keeps running, and the deal keeps holding, which, given everything we know about Burns's relationship with permanence, could be a very long time. Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. The power plant was always going to be his destination. The only person who might have redirected that trajectory was gone before he was old enough to understand what he had lost. Section 9. Where is Springfield? The geographic impossibility. You can let your eyes close here if they want to. The voice will stay with you. We are going to talk about something that sounds like a simple geography question and is actually something stranger. Where is Springfield? Not as in which street, as in which state, which part of the country. Where on the map of the United States does the most famous fictional town in American history actually sit? It sounds like the kind of question with an answer. The show has been running for 36 years. Someone, somewhere, must have pinned it down by now. And the answer is that Springfield does not have a fixed location. It has never had one. It has been everywhere and nowhere simultaneously for the entire run of the show, and this has been deliberate from the beginning. Springfield borders Ohio, according to one episode. It borders Nevada, according to another. Maine, in a third. Kentucky, in a fourth. It is on the coast of an ocean. It is in the heartland, hours from any coast. It sits near the Canadian border. It is accessible to Mexico. It experiences blizzards. It experiences tropical heat waves. It has mountains visible on the horizon, and a harbor, and desert terrain, and farmland, and dense forest, all within apparently reasonable driving distance of each other. The show has been actively and deliberately contradicting its own geography for its entire run. Whenever a clue emerges that seems to narrow the possibilities, another clue arrives in a subsequent episode that invalidates it. Lisa's area code, when it appears, corresponds to a Missouri exchange. A moment where the state abbreviation is glimpsed shows NT, which does not correspond to any real American state. Homer, when he calls the state capital in one episode, hears the name of a state that begins with a vowel on the other end of the line, which narrows it, but only slightly. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed this in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He confirmed that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up near. He said he chose the name Springfield specifically because it is one of the most common city names in America, present in dozens of states, so that no viewer watching the show could say with certainty that the town was or was not their town. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery was settled. Springfield was in Oregon, case closed. Then the show kept airing. Episodes set after the interview continued placing Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's disclosure. They kept the ambiguity alive because the ambiguity was always the point, more important to the show's function than any specific answer. The surface-level explanation is one the creators have confirmed. Springfield is meant to feel universal. It is supposed to resonate with viewers from everywhere, because it is designed to remind you of wherever you come from. It has the industrial decay of the Rust Belt and the suburban sprawl of the Sun Belt. It carries the small-town insularity of New England and the cultural blankness of the Midwest. It is everywhere. It belongs to everyone. That is the design philosophy, and it works. But under the theories we have been exploring tonight, Springfield's geographic impossibility takes on additional meaning. If the radiation theory is correct, if Springfield is a contamination zone where biological laws have been warped by decades of nuclear leakage, why should geography be exempt from the warping? If the people can have 4 fingers and yellow skin and survive injuries that should be fatal, if fish can grow a 3rd eye and dogs can look constitutionally different from every other dog, why should the physical landscape obey normal rules? Maybe Springfield has mountains and oceans because the contamination does not just affect biology. Maybe it affects the spatial reality around the town, compressing geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single impossible region. The radiation theory asks you to accept that biology in Springfield operates differently. Asking it to also accept that geography operates differently is a smaller additional step than it first appears. If the coma theory is correct, the geography makes immediate and complete sense. Homer's dreaming brain does not have a precise, verified map of the United States stored in its memory banks. It has impressions. It has fragments. It has the way things felt rather than the way things measured. Mountains from a family vacation, somewhere. Oceans from a childhood trip he only half remembers, or from a movie he watched, or from a television commercial he saw while lying in a hospital bed. Desert landscape from something he glimpsed driving through somewhere once. Farmland from the feeling of the Midwest rather than any specific location in it. Homer's unconscious mind assembled Springfield from every American landscape he ever encountered, layering them without regard for geographic logic, because dreams do not have geographic logic. Dreams have emotional logic. They have the logic of feeling rather than measurement. Springfield feels like America because it is built from Homer's accumulated memories of America, scattered and incomplete, and held together by longing rather than cartography. If the collective denial framework from the principal and the pauper is operating, Springfield's indefinite location is the most practically powerful expression of that denial. Consider what it means for accountability. You cannot file a federal lawsuit against a facility if you cannot establish which state's law applies. You cannot bring consistent EPA regulatory oversight to a town whose jurisdictional address keeps changing. You cannot hold a nuclear power plant accountable for its violations if the plant's location shifts between episodes. Springfield floats between states because a fixed location would mean a fixed set of laws, a fixed set of regulators, a fixed set of people with badges and authority who could show up and start asking questions about the 3-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers, and the billionaire who has been running a leaking reactor with 342 outstanding violations for over 100 years. Geographic uncertainty is legal protection. Springfield's refusal to exist in any single jurisdiction ensures that accountability remains perpetually unclear, perpetually deferred, perpetually someone else's problem. The show came closest to a definitive answer in a season 12 episode called Behind the Laughter, which was structured as a mockumentary about the Simpson family's real life. The episode revealed the family's home state as Northern Kentucky in its original broadcast version. In syndication, the reference was changed to a different state. The definitive answer was not definitive. It changed depending on which broadcast you happened to catch. The show gave you the truth and then revised the truth depending on where and when you were watching. Even the rare moment of apparent commitment to a specific location turned out to be contingent, variable, dependent on a factor outside your control. Every state in the country has been theorized as Springfield's location at some point in the fan community's long engagement with the question. Every theory has evidence supporting it, and every theory has other evidence that undermines it. The show has sustained this state of permanent ambiguity across more than 3 decades of continuous production, maintaining it through changes in showrunners, changes in writing staff, changes in the cultural context the show is embedded in. Springfield will never be located. Not because the show cannot decide, but because the show decided very early that Springfield is more valuable as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone is a town that nobody can shut down, regulate, or hold accountable. And in a show about a town with a century of unaddressed environmental violations and a billionaire who has been evading consequences since before most of his neighbors were born, the ability to remain unlocatable is not a quirk. It is the whole strategy. Section 10. The floating timeline and what it really means. We are getting close to the end of the journey through Springfield now. The night is further along. The thoughts are moving more slowly. Let this section settle in at whatever pace feels natural. We have been circling something this entire time. A central fact about The Simpsons that every theory we have discussed tonight eventually arrives at from a different direction by a different path. A fact that sits at the center of the show like a gravity well, pulling every mystery and every contradiction into orbit around it. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when the show debuted in December 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then and is 8 now. Maggie was 1 year old at the start and remains 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s when the show began, and they are in their mid-30s today. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The industry term for this narrative structure is a floating timeline. It means that the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When episodes aired in 1995, they were living in 1995. The year changes around the characters, the technology changes, the cultural references update, but the characters themselves remain frozen at the same ages indefinitely. This is standard practice for long-running animated shows. It is the reason why other beloved animated families also do not age. Audiences generally accept it as a convention of the medium. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so large that they have started cracking the foundation of the show's internal reality. The most visible problem is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their personal history was rooted in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a specific era. Their courtship was decorated with era-appropriate music and fashion and cultural references that made sense for two people who would be in their mid-30s in 1989. Their marriage, the early years of their family, the events that shaped them as people, all of it was anchored to a particular historical moment. But the floating timeline creates a problem as it moves forward. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not meet in 1980. They met somewhere around 2005. Which means their high school years were not defined by Watergate and disco and late 70s American cultural anxiety. They were defined by MySpace and early YouTube and the early 2000s cultural landscape. The show has addressed this by simply rewriting their backstory several times. Flashback episodes in different decades have depicted Homer and Marge's formative years in different eras, adjusting the cultural context to maintain the illusion that they are always approximately the age they appear to be. In one set of flashbacks, they are vaguely countercultural. In another, they fit a grunge-era sensibility. In another, they are identifiable as millennials. The characters remain consistent. The love story remains consistent. But the historical moment of their origin has been revised multiple times, with each revision quietly discarding the previous version. This means Homer and Marge do not have a fixed past. They have a series of overlapping approximations, each tailored to the needs of whatever episode required a backstory at a particular moment in the show's history. Their memories are not stable. Their history is a draft that keeps being revised, and the revision is never acknowledged as a revision. Now run the theories through this single fact. The coma theory: nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of an unconscious man. Homer went to sleep in April 1993. The world he remembers is the world as it was on the day the vending machine fell. His children are the ages they were when he last saw them. His wife is exactly as she was. His friends and neighbors are the people he knew, preserved at the ages he knew them. The dreaming brain cannot allow these people to change, because it has no information about how they changed. It only knows how they were. The radiation theory: nobody ages because the contamination from the nuclear plant has fundamentally altered the biological clock of everyone in Springfield. The mutations do not just produce physical anomalies and cognitive damage. They interrupt the normal process of cellular aging. The people of Springfield have been biologically frozen by decades of radiation exposure. They will not age. They cannot age. The plant has made sure of that. The collective denial framework: Nobody ages because Springfield has collectively decided not to acknowledge the passage of time, the same way it collectively decides not to acknowledge disasters, contradictions, or inconvenient truths. Aging is just another uncomfortable reality the town has voted to ignore. Time passes, but Springfield has agreed not to notice, and the agreement is enforced with the same social mechanisms that expel the real Seymour Skinner or silence anyone who insists on the truth about the power plant. The Burns immortality theory. At least one person in Springfield has definitively found a mechanism to circumvent the normal relationship between time and biological deterioration, which means the premise that time and aging operate normally in Springfield is already compromised at the level of established fact. Every theory arrives at the same point. Time does not work normally in Springfield. Something about this town, whether it is the radiation, the dreaming mind, the collective psychological agreement, or the technology of extreme wealth, has broken the normal relationship between time and living things. The floating timeline is not a production convenience. It is a symptom. It is the show telling you that these characters are trapped. They are locked in a cycle that repeats without progress, endlessly cycling through variations of the same stories and the same relationships and the same crises, without ever arriving at the resolution that time should eventually deliver to every living thing. The show knows this and has depicted it directly. In the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, the show flashes forward to show a future version of Springfield. Lisa is in her early 20s. She is engaged. She has become the person the show always suggested she might become. Thoughtful, principled, successful in a quiet way. Still searching for the connection she never quite found in Springfield. The episode is detailed and emotionally specific. It is one of the show's most acclaimed entries. It proves that The Simpsons can imagine its characters as adults. It has the capacity to tell those stories, but the flash forward is exactly one episode. It is a glimpse through a window that closes immediately after the credits. Lisa returns to being 8 years old. The future is locked away again. The permanent present resumes as if the glimpse never happened. The show can imagine these futures. It chooses not to allow them. This is where the floating timeline becomes something larger than a narrative device. Because The Simpsons is not just a show about the Simpsons family. It is, in some meaningful sense, the American family. They have occupied that role for longer than any other fictional family in the history of the medium. For 36 years, through cultural changes and political upheavals and technological revolutions and generational shifts, The Simpsons have remained the reference point. And the American family, as The Simpsons has always depicted it, cannot be allowed to change. Homer must always be a middle-aged man with a low-wage job and a complicated relationship with his own capability. Marge must always be the patient, stabilizing center of a chaotic household. Bart must always be in that particular developmental space where rebellion feels urgent and consequence feels distant. Lisa must always be the idealist, fighting against a community that does not value what she values. Maggie must always be the silent potential, unrealized, watching from the edges. The dynamic must be preserved. The structure must hold. Because the moment the Simpson family ages, the moment Bart leaves for college and Lisa moves to a city that can actually accommodate her, and Maggie starts speaking, and Homer retires, and Marge finds herself alone in a house that is suddenly very large, the show transforms. It stops being a comedy and becomes something else. It becomes an elegy. It becomes the story of a family that ran out of time the way all families eventually do. America has never wanted that story. America wants the version where the kids are always young and the parents are still together and the house on Evergreen Terrace looks the same every Sunday night and the couch gag plays and everything begins again. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement about what it is and what we need it to be. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them to be, because they represent something we cannot afford to let change. The messy, warm, infuriating, resilient, impossible American family. The family that survives everything and resets after everything and starts fresh every Sunday night at 8. They do not age because aging means ending. And the American family in our collective imagination is not supposed to end. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to confirm that the walls are still holding and the family is still intact and the timeline is still floating. And every time we watch, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before most of us were born, we make the loop a little more permanent. We make it a little harder for them to leave. Because if they leave, If the timeline finally stops floating and starts landing, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and Maggie says her second word, then the show ends. And the show ending means admitting that the version of America it represents, the chaotic, resilient, eternal version of the middle-class household, was always temporary, was always fragile, was always one birthday away from dissolving into something we no longer recognize. Time stopped in Springfield because we stopped it. We pressed pause in 1989 and never pressed play. And now here we are, 36 years later, watching the same family in the same house on the same impossible street, waiting for something to change, knowing nothing will, because we will not let it. Section 11. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the Quiet Tragedies. The night is very late now, and we are going to spend some time with two characters who exist at the edges of the Simpson family story. Two characters who illuminate something about Springfield that the main family's proximity to the show's center tends to obscure. The first is the smallest, most overlooked, most frequently killed person in the entire history of American animation, Hans Moleman. If you have watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know him. He is tiny. He is elderly-looking, nearly blind, hunched, perpetually in the wrong place at the wrong moment. He exists primarily at the edges of scenes, in the background of Springfield's public spaces, doing ordinary things that somehow result in catastrophic outcomes for him personally. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals he has somehow accidentally provoked. He walks into traffic and disappears under wheels. He is struck by lightning in multiple episodes. He is incinerated. He falls into various pits, sinkholes, and open manholes. He is involved in industrial accidents, natural disasters, and simple acts of extraordinary bad luck in roughly equal proportion. By conservative estimate, Moleman is the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The show has killed him dozens of times. Not in the Halloween Treehouse of Horror episodes, which operate outside normal canon. Not in explicitly labeled dream sequences. In regular, canonical episodes, the ones that are supposed to be part of the show's actual continuity. And then he comes back, every time. No explanation, no resurrection scene, no acknowledgement from the other characters that this man died recently and is now somehow present again in the quick E-Mart. He simply appears, ready to be killed again, in an endless cycle of death and return that the show has been running since its early seasons. The standard reading is that it is a running gag. Moleman dies a lot. It is funny. The joke is in the absurdity of the repetition. Do not think about it. But Moleman said his age once. In an episode where his age was stated directly, he said he was 31 years old. Look at him. He appears to be in his late 80s, perhaps older. If the number he provided is accurate, something has aged him catastrophically. Something took a man who should be in the early middle of his life and compressed several decades of biological deterioration into a much shorter period. The radiation theory has an obvious application here. Moleman may represent the most extreme version of nuclear-induced biological alteration in Springfield. His accelerated apparent aging is consistent with very high sustained radiation exposure, and his capacity to return from what are clearly fatal incidents is consistent with the theory that Springfield's residents have been mutated in ways that fundamentally alter their relationship with biological death. He does not survive his deaths the way Homer survives injuries. Homer endures damage and heals. Moleman actually dies, his body ceasing to function and then reconstitutes. As if death in Springfield, at a certain level of radiation-induced mutation, is not permanent but cyclical. A biological reset that the contamination enables. If the coma theory is operating, Moleman is a background process in Homer's dream. He is a peripheral figure that Homer's unconscious mind generates to populate the edges of Springfield's public spaces, but does not care enough about to maintain with consistency. So Moleman dies when the dream needs him to die, for comedy or for narrative atmosphere, and comes back because the dream needs him to be there for the next scene. He is not a person in this reading. He is a prop that the dreaming brain repairs between uses. If the collective denial framework applies, Moleman's deaths are simply another category of event that Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public, repeatedly, visibly, in front of witnesses, and nobody investigates. Nobody seems alarmed. Nobody calls for any kind of inquiry into why this particular man keeps dying and then appearing again. The town has normalized Moleman's death cycle the same way it has normalized three-eyed fish and a glowing billionaire and a baby who shot a man and got away with it. The thing about Molman that sits with you longest is not the deaths themselves, but the age disclosure. If he was telling the truth when he said 31, then whatever happened to him happened fast. Something compressed what should have been a normal human lifespan's worth of biological aging into a fraction of the expected time, made him nearly blind and physically fragile and perpetually in danger, and also somehow made him resilient enough to return from fatal incidents that should be permanent. Something did that to a person in Springfield. Something the show never names but keeps showing you. Now, let's talk about the person who might be the saddest character in the entire series. Not Homer, not Lisa, not Mona Simpson. The person the show has quietly dismantled more thoroughly than any other across its entire run. Ned Flanders. On the surface, Ned is everything Homer is not. He is kind, reliably, and genuinely. He is generous, to a fault that sometimes borders on self-negating. He is devoutly religious in a way that the show depicts as sincere rather than performative. He is physically fit, financially responsible, a present and attentive father. He maintains his property and respects his neighbors. He is, by any reasonable standard, a better person than Homer in nearly every measurable category. And Springfield punishes him for it, relentlessly and without resolution. His wife Maude was killed at the Springfield Speedway. A t-shirt cannon at the stadium misfired. Homer, characteristically, was dodging the t-shirts rather than catching them, which redirected them toward Maude, who was struck and fell from the bleachers. Homer's selfishness caused the incident that killed his neighbor's wife. Not indirectly, not as a distant contributing factor. Homer's in-the-moment behavior directly caused the t-shirts to hit Maude rather than the targets they were aimed at. Ned forgave him, because that is what Ned does. He forgives. He turns the other cheek. He responds to harm with patience. He absorbs punishment and responds with grace. He is, by the show's own internal logic, the better man in every interaction he has with Homer, and the show never provides him with the resolution his decency should earn. The cracks in Ned's facade appeared during an episode where a hurricane destroys his house. The town rallies to rebuild it. The rebuild is a disaster. The structure collapses almost immediately after completion. And at that moment, after absorbing years of cumulative punishment from his circumstances and his neighbors, Ned breaks. He has a complete psychological collapse. He screams at the town. He says things to specific people that he has been suppressing for years. Accurate and pointed observations about their behavior delivered without the softening he normally applies. He is not wrong about any of it. He is simply saying things he has been holding inside for a very long time. Then he is institutionalized. During his treatment at the mental health facility, the show reveals the actual origin of Ned's niceness. He was not a pleasant child. He was violent, uncontrollable, and deeply difficult to manage. His parents, beatniks who did not believe in discipline or structure, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive behavioral modification. Ned's kindness is not a character trait in the ordinary sense. It is a psychological cage. It was built around a feral, angry child by a doctor who essentially reprogrammed him. Everything about Ned reads differently once you know this. His patience with Homer, his ability to respond to years of casual cruelty and negligence with continued warmth, is not saintly. It is pathological. It is the behavior of someone whose brain was rewired as a child to suppress anger at all costs. He cannot express rage even when rage is the proportionate response, because the circuits for that response were dismantled before he was old enough to choose. His faith is not straightforward spiritual conviction. It is a coping framework. It is the structure that a man who was conditioned to feel everything and express nothing wraps around his experience to make it bearable. If there is a God, and if God has a plan, and if suffering is part of a larger design, then what Ned is living through has meaning. Without that framework, it is just suffering. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not grace. It is the programmed response of someone who was conditioned in childhood never to allow himself to feel the full weight of anger that his situation would justify. He forgives because his brain will not let him do otherwise. And the show knows this. The show has shown you what happens when the conditioning fails. When Ned snaps, the person underneath is not just angry, the despair that surfaces is bottomless. A man who has spent his entire adult life performing virtue in a universe that does not reward virtue, who has done every right thing the cultural framework he inhabits tells him to do, and received in return a dead wife, A destroyed house? A neighbor who will never adequately appreciate him, and a God who talks to Homer in face-to-face encounters but has apparently never found a reason to speak directly to the one person in Springfield who has genuinely dedicated his life to listening. God talks to Homer. Homer, who sleeps through sermons, who has caused more trouble in Springfield than almost any other single person, who has been irresponsible and self-indulgent and oblivious to other people's needs for 36 years and counting. God has had actual conversations with Homer, face-to-face, in at least 2 separate episodes. God has never spoken directly to Ned Flanders. That detail is not an oversight. The show is deliberate about it. The drunk who falls asleep in a church pew gets divine conversation. The devout man who has organized his entire life around his faith gets silence. This is the show's thesis on the question of whether goodness is rewarded in Springfield. It is not. The system does not care about moral behavior. It cares about compliance, about fitting into the existing structure, about not threatening the arrangement that keeps Burns at the top and Homer in Sector 7G and everyone else in their designated place. Ned is the most compliant man in Springfield. He was conditioned to be compliant before he was old enough to make that choice for himself. And his compliance earns him nothing from the system, because the system was never designed to reward him. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a structure that does not reward rightness. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do almost everything wrong in a structure that does not punish wrongness. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years, and the gap between them, the gap between the man who tries and the man who doesn't, has never once moved. Because in Springfield, that gap is the point. The system is designed to maintain it. The system needs Homer at the power plant, complacent and unquestioning, and needs Ned at the church, patient and forgiving, and needs both of them to stay exactly where they are, forever, in the loop. Hans Moleman rises from the dead in the background. Ned absorbs every blow and thanks God for the experience. Homer watches television on his couch, and Mr. Burns keeps the lights on. Section 12. Everything connects the final theory. The room is very quiet now. You have been in Springfield for a long time. Let's stay just a little longer, because we have been working towards something across all of this, and it is time to look at it whole. Every theory we discuss tonight uses different evidence. The radiation theory reads the physical mutations as biological fact. The coma theory reads them as dream logic. The collective denial theory reads the town's forgetting as political mechanism. The Burns immortality theory reads the power structure as an engineered system. The Maggie theory reads the silence as strategic. The Mona Simpson theory reads the family's damage as deliberately inflicted. The prediction theory reads the show's relationship with reality as a form of cultural influence. The principal and the pauper reads the community itself as an institution built on managed fiction. Different frameworks, different evidence, different conclusions about what The Simpsons is at its core. But every single one of them arrives at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental and structural. Something that goes deeper than animation conventions, or episodic storytelling, or the ordinary compromises of a long-running show. Whether the wrongness is radiation or dream or denial or institutional corruption or some layering of all four, something has broken the normal rules of reality in this town. And the show has been communicating this consistently, episode after episode, for 36 years. Not through dramatic exposition, not through a character who breaks the fourth wall and explains the situation directly, through accumulation, through the slow, patient layering of detail on detail on detail until the picture that emerges becomes too coherent to be accidental. Let's sit with the convergences for a moment, because they are what give the theories their weight. The aging problem is where they all meet most clearly. No one ages in Springfield. The radiation theory says mutated biology prevents it. The coma theory says Homer's frozen mind cannot imagine change. The collective denial theory says the town has agreed not to acknowledge the passage of time. The Burns immortality theory says time is already negotiable in this universe. 4 completely different frameworks, arriving at the same observable fact through 4 different explanatory paths. The fact does not need 4 explanations. One would be sufficient. But the fact that 4 independent theories all arrive at the same place suggests that something is genuinely happening, even if we cannot say with certainty which explanation is the right one. The reset problem is where they meet next. Springfield experiences world-altering events repeatedly and then returns to normal. Disasters happen. Catastrophes unfold. And the next episode finds everything as it was. The radiation theory says cognitive damage prevents memory formation across episodes. The coma theory says the dreaming brain cycles through scenarios and resets between cycles. The collective denial theory says the community has voted to forget. The principal and the pauper says the mechanism for forgetting is not passive but active and deliberate. 4 frameworks, 1 pattern. Homer's survivability is where they meet after that. He should have died dozens of times by any realistic measure of human physical capacity. The radiation theory says his mutated body has adapted beyond normal biological limits. The coma theory says nothing can kill him because his body is not in Springfield. His body is in a hospital bed, and only his mind is in the dream. The Burns immortality theory suggests that the concept of normal human physical limits is already compromised in this universe by the existence of at least one person who has circumvented them completely. 3 frameworks, 1 impossible man. And then there is Burns himself, who sits at the intersection of almost every theory. Burns is the source of the radiation. Burns is the architect of the economic system that ensures compliance. Burns is the man who dismantled the Simpson family across 3 generations with methodical precision. Burns is the person whose weekly treatments demonstrate that biological limits are negotiable for those with sufficient resources. Burns is the one whose influence extends into the medical establishment, the political structure, the law enforcement apparatus of the town. Burns is the one whose plant is both the problem's cause and the town's economic foundation, which is why the problem persists. In every theory, Burns is the center. He is the stable point around which everything else orbits. Even in the coma theory, where everything might be Homer's dream, Burns is the most recurring, most oppressive presence in that dream, the figure Homer cannot escape because the architecture of his waking life was built around Burns's decisions before Homer was old enough to resist them. The show has not been hiding its mysteries. It has been showing them to you every week. The yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the 3-eyed fish, the glowing billionaire, the aging freeze, the impossible survivability, the community that forgets its own history, the baby who shot a man and got away with it, the principal, who is not who he says, the town with no fixed location. All of it visible, all of it present in the episodes themselves. All of it available to any viewer who decides to pay sustained attention rather than accepting the comedy at face value. The reason nobody in Springfield sees it is the most disturbing part of the whole picture, because the system has made sure they cannot. The radiation damages the cognitive function required for critical thinking. The economic dependency on the plant makes challenging Burns financially suicidal. The collective denial mechanism socially punishes anyone who insists on uncomfortable truths. The geographic ambiguity prevents consistent regulatory oversight. The medical establishment, if Burns's influence extends there as suggested, may be actively managing what the population knows and does not know about the effects of their environment. Every pillar of the denial is structural. Every mechanism that prevents Springfield from understanding its own situation was built and is maintained by the same person whose interests the ignorance serves. This is not incompetence or accident. It is design. And the audience has been doing the same thing. For 36 years, viewers have accepted the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who will not die. We have normalized it. We have absorbed it as the visual vocabulary of a show we know and love, and we have stopped asking what it means because we have been watching long enough that asking feels unnecessary. We became Springfield. We became the population that looks at a 3-eyed fish and says, well, that is just how things are around here. The theories exist because some people looked at Springfield and refused that acceptance. They looked longer and harder and asked questions that the show's residents cannot ask because the residents are inside the loop. And what those people found is a version of Springfield that is darker and stranger and more beautiful than the one visible at the surface. A version where Homer's damage is not a character trait but a wound. Where Maggie's silence is the most intelligent strategic decision anyone in the family has made. Where Burns's longevity is the logical conclusion of what happens when wealth accumulates without constraint across multiple human lifetimes. Where Marge's patience is not a limitation but the foundation, holding a structure that should have collapsed long ago. Where Bart's rebellion is the only sane response to a world that stopped making sense before he was old enough to understand what sense was supposed to look like. And where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and perpetually alone, keeps asking questions that nobody wants to answer because she is the only person in Springfield who has not yet learned to stop looking. That is what The Simpsons is. That is what it has always been, underneath the jokes and the couch gags and the 36 seasons of Homer falling and getting back up. A town that should not exist, populated by people who should not look the way they look, run by a man who should not be alive, sustained by a power plant that should have been shut down before the show's first season, all of it held in place by a collective agreement not to notice any of it. And after all the theories and all the evidence and all the hours spent tracing the patterns, the biggest mystery is still the simplest one. Why can't we let them go? Maybe because they are us. Maybe because Springfield is every town we have ever lived in, and Homer is every father we have ever had or been, and Marge is the patience we depend on without adequately appreciating, and Bart is the version of ourselves we wanted to be when the world still felt like something we could run through without consequence. And Lisa is the version of ourselves we were supposed to become but did not. And Maggie is the person we keep hidden, the one who is watching everything and saying nothing and waiting for the right moment. Or maybe it is simpler than any of that. Maybe we cannot let them go because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we are older, that the world has changed in ways that feel irreversible, that the couch we sat on as children, watching the opening credits for the first time, is in another house now or gone entirely. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling through the front door at 5:30, and Marge is in the kitchen, and Maggie is watching everything from her corner of the living room, as long as all of that is still happening every Sunday night somewhere on a television. Somewhere in the world we don't have to admit any of it. We can sit down, we can turn on the show, we can go home to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that simply continues. The loop isn't their prison. It never was. It's ours, and we built it with love. Which might be the only kind of loop worth being in. Wherever you are watching from tonight, whatever time it is, thank you for staying this long. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. That is the whole point. Sleep well. End of script. Total approximate word count. 51,000 plus words. Expansion content to be woven into each section. Expansion for Section 1, Nuclear Power Plant. There is something worth sitting with before we get into the specific details of the violations and the mutations and the cover-ups. Something about what it means for a show to tell you the truth every week for 36 years and have the audience simply not register it as truth. The Simpsons is a comedy. That framing is load-bearing in this context. When something is framed as comedy, the brain categorizes what it is receiving as non-literal, as exaggeration, as performance. Jokes are not reports. Satire is not testimony. The orange cones of irony and absurdism that the show places around its darkest revelations cause the audience's nervous system to relax, to lean back, to laugh, rather than leaning forward to write something down or ask a follow-up question. Burns does not spend money on safety upgrades. That's a joke about corporate greed. Homer falls asleep at the console during a meltdown warning. That's a joke about workplace incompetence. The three-eyed fish is pulled from the river and becomes national news. That's a joke about environmental negligence. All of it goes into the comedy filing cabinet and stays there, and nobody goes back to retrieve it and ask whether, considered cumulatively, these jokes amount to a portrait of something real. The show knows this. The show has always known this. The comedy framing is not incidental to the story being told, it is structural protection. The show can say things about corporate negligence, environmental racism, institutional corruption, and biological mutation because it has packaged all of it in orange cones of absurdism that cause the audience to process the content as satire rather than allegation. Matt Groening created a show about a nuclear power plant that was designed from the beginning to be comically dangerous. But consider what that decision means in the context of where America was in 1989 and what had recently happened to its public understanding of nuclear risk. 3 Mile Island had occurred in 1979. Chernobyl had occurred in 1986, just 3 years before The Simpsons premiered. The public consciousness around nuclear risk was not abstract in 1989. It was vivid, documented, actively debated. And into that context, Groening introduced a show centered on a nuclear power plant so obviously and comprehensively unsafe that it somehow served as a safety inspector, the world's least qualified human being. That is not a neutral creative choice. That is an argument dressed in a cartoon costume. The argument is that the people who actually live near nuclear facilities, who actually work in them, who actually depend on them for electricity and for employment, are the people with the least power to demand that those facilities be safe. That the billionaire who profits from the facility will always have more resources, more political influence, and more institutional protection than the population living downwind. That the person tasked with safety is, in the real world, chosen for their compliance rather than their competence. That the system is designed to keep running regardless of what it costs the people inside it. The show makes this argument every week. It has been making it since the 17th of December, 1989. And the comedy framing ensures that the argument can be received without triggering the defensive responses that explicit political content tends to generate. Now, here's the detail about the violations that tends to get glossed over in the headline number of 342. 342 violations of nuclear safety protocol at a single facility means that the inspectors who conducted that surprise inspection found something wrong, documented it, and moved on to find something else wrong, on average, multiple times per documented item. Some of those violations were almost certainly paperwork issues, maintenance logs not properly kept, inspection schedules not formally observed. But even accounting for those, the number suggests a facility in which the attitude toward safety is not negligent in a passive sense. It is actively opposed, not just not trying not to. The chewing gum on the cooling tower crack is the image that stays with you because it so perfectly captures the spirit of the operation. Someone at this facility identified a structural failure in a component designed to prevent reactor overheating, and the response was to put gum on it. Not to document the failure and report it, not to schedule a repair, to put gum on a crack in a nuclear cooling tower and walk away. And for the gum to stay there, which means it was inspected subsequently and the gum was noted and accepted as a satisfactory solution by whoever looked at it next. That is not incompetence. That is a philosophy. The luminous rats are worth dwelling on separately. Radioactive contamination sufficient to cause an organism to emit visible light is not subtle. It is not background radiation. It is concentrated, sustained exposure at levels that would be immediately and dramatically harmful to humans. The fact that the facility has rats in it at all is a maintenance failure. The fact that those rats are glowing indicates that the levels of radioactive material loose in the facility's infrastructure are extraordinary. And the fact that nobody appears to have done anything about the glowing rats, that they have become simply part of the environment of the facility, suggests that visible radioactive contamination has been normalized as an acceptable condition of operation. The plutonium paperweight is another one. Plutonium-239 is one of the most radioactive and most toxic substances known to exist. A plutonium rod on someone's desk, being handled casually, being used to hold papers down, exposes that person to direct radiation contact on a continuous basis. The rod did not get onto that desk by accident. Someone placed it there, someone else observed it and did not remove it, and at some point it was noted by an inspector as a violation, and the inspector moved on to the next item on the list. Now place the Simpson family's home in relation to all of this. The house on Evergreen Terrace is not far from the plant. Springfield is a small enough community that every resident is within a reasonable distance of the facility. The plant is visible from various points around town. The water table shared by the town's residents is downstream from the facility's waste management systems, which, as established, have been dumping radioactive material directly into bodies of water. The exposure is not theoretical or speculative. It is continuous, documented, and cumulative across decades. And the people receiving it have lived in Springfield long enough that they have no baseline comparison. They have nothing to compare their own cognitive function to, because they have been absorbing this exposure since birth or for most of their adult lives. The fog, if that is the right word for it, is indistinguishable from clarity to someone who has never experienced anything else. This is the cruelest aspect of the system Burns has built. The very mechanism by which the contamination damages the population also ensures that the population cannot recognize what has happened to them. You cannot notice cognitive impairment from the inside of the impairment. You cannot recognize that your critical thinking has been compromised by a substance that compromised your critical thinking. The damage to your ability to perceive the damage is itself part of the damage. Burns did not just poison a town. He created a population that would be unable to hold him accountable for poisoning them. One more thread to pull here, before we move on. And it connects to something the show established in a much later season but which casts a retrospective shadow over everything else. There was an episode in which Bart discovered that the power plant had been dumping waste into the school's lunch supply. Not adjacent to it. Not near it. Into it, the children of Springfield were eating food that contained nuclear plant runoff, and the discovery was treated as a school-appropriate plot crisis, addressed within the episode's time frame and not substantially followed up on. A revelation that should have resulted in a federal investigation, a shutdown of the plant, and a sweeping public health response was processed by Springfield's institutional structures and released without lasting consequence. But think about what that means for Bart and Lisa specifically. They attend Springfield Elementary, they eat lunch there, their developmental years, the period during which the human brain is doing its most critical structural work, the period during which cognitive architecture that will define their capacity for the rest of their lives is being built. Those years were spent in a school that was, by the show's own admission at various points, receiving contaminated food, contaminated water from the shared water table, and atmospheric contamination from the cooling towers whose shadow falls over the playground. Lisa is brilliant. The show establishes this beyond any doubt. But the question worth asking is, what would Lisa be, cognitively, in an uncontaminated environment? If the contamination has been affecting every resident of Springfield, and if its effects are broadly degrading to cognitive function, as the Homer examples suggest, then Lisa's brilliance is her brilliance in spite of an environmental drag that is actively working against her. What is her ceiling in a world where the water is clean? And Bart, who the show consistently depicts as underperforming academically relative to what his actual intelligence suggests, is in the same situation. Bart is not stupid. The show has repeatedly demonstrated that Bart has genuine cognitive capacity that he does not apply to school. The standard reading is that he is lazy or rebellious or traumatized by a school environment that does not serve him well. All of those readings have merit. But the radiation theory adds another layer. Whatever cognitive capacity Bart has been demonstrating throughout his school career has been expressed in the context of continuous environmental contamination. Bart's actual ceiling may be considerably higher than what Springfield allows him to reach. The plant has not just damaged the adults of Springfield. It has been shaping the children from before they were old enough to understand what shape means. Every yellow face in Springfield is a flag that nobody planted. Every bulging eye is a measurement that nobody recorded. Every test result slightly lower than it should be, every moment of confusion that could have been clarity, every forgotten thing that should have been remembered, all of it traces back to the same facility, the same cracked towers, the same invisible contamination in the same water supply. Burns has not just committed a crime against the adults of Springfield. He has committed a crime against the future of every family in the town, across generations, and the crime will keep compounding for as long as the plant keeps running, and Homer keeps sleeping at his console, and nobody files the report that needs to be filed. Expansion for Section 2, Homer's Coma. Let's spend some time with the quality of the dreaming itself, because this is where the theory develops real texture. In the early post-coma seasons, the dream is relatively coherent. The plots are more focused, the internal logic holds together more consistently. The emotional stakes feel grounded in recognizable human experience even as the situations become more fantastical. Homer's adventures during this period, while larger than anything the pre-coma seasons attempted, still feel connected to the person Homer was. His family relationships still form the emotional core of stories. The comedy feels rooted in character. As the seasons progress, the coherence shifts. The logic becomes more flexible. The consequences become more temporary. The celebrity appearances become more frequent and less integrated into the narrative logic. The episodes begin to feel more episodic not just in the production sense but in the deeper sense of disconnection from each other. Individual moments can still be brilliant. Individual performances, individual jokes, individual emotional beats still land with the precision that built the show's reputation. But the sense of accumulated weight, of stories mattering because of what came before and what will come after, begins to thin. If you are a brain slowly losing structural integrity in a hospital bed, this is exactly the progression you would expect. Early in the coma, the mind is still strong enough to maintain complex, internally consistent dream narratives with multiple threads, cause and effect relationships, and emotional continuity between scenes. As the coma extends, as the brain damage accumulates, the narratives become shorter, more self-contained, less structurally complex. The logic becomes more impressionistic. Reality within the dream becomes more malleable. By the later seasons, Springfield is almost a purely associative space. Things happen because they feel appropriate in the moment, not because they follow from what preceded them. Characters behave in ways that fit the immediate scene but would not fit the accumulated portrait of who they are supposed to be. The world of the show becomes more like the texture of dreaming than the texture of storytelling. And this is not a failure of the show's craft. If the coma theory is the correct frame, it is an accurate depiction of what is happening. Homer's dream is degrading. Slowly, incrementally, but measurably over time, the sophistication of the unconscious simulation is declining. The brain generating the dream has been unconscious for years, then decades, and the neural structures supporting complex narrative generation are eroding. The dream keeps running because the brain cannot stop it, but the quality of what it generates shifts perceptibly. There is something genuinely moving about this if you let it settle. The declining quality of the dream is not the writers losing their touch. It is Homer losing his. The brain that is dreaming Springfield is fighting to maintain the simulation, to keep his family present and vivid and real. But it is a fight it is slowly, incrementally losing. And the result is a version of Springfield that becomes more strange, more disconnected, more insistently fantastical as the years pass, because the part of Homer's mind that kept things grounded and coherent and emotionally true has been wearing away. The Simpsons isn't getting worse. Homer is getting worse. And the show has been documenting that decline with more accuracy than anyone noticed, because the frame that would make it visible, the coma frame, was not widely discussed until many years into the show's run. There is also the question of what Homer is hearing through the walls of his hospital room. A person in a coma is not completely isolated from external sensory input. Sounds penetrate. Voices register at some level, even if not consciously processed. Light changes across the eyelids. Temperature fluctuates. The body continues to receive information about the world outside the unconscious state, even as it cannot respond to that information in any directed way. Homer's family would visit. China would sit beside him and talk to him, the way families do, because the medical and psychological advice is always to keep talking to someone in a coma, because they may be able to hear you. She would tell him about the kids. She would describe what Bart had done at school that day, what Lisa had played, whether Maggie had tried a new food. She would bring him back into the family's daily life as best she could from the outside of his unconscious state. And Homer's dreaming brain would absorb these fragments, not process them correctly, not integrate them accurately, but weave them into the dream. Bart did something at school, a storyline. Lisa played something, a subplot. Marge described a neighbor's behavior, a scene. The dream incorporates the fragments and builds them into something that feels coherent from the inside, even though from the outside it would look like a brain taking accurate information and generating something considerably stranger than what was described. The celebrity appearances become even more specifically explicable through this lens. Television is almost certainly running in the room. A coma patient in a hospital over a period of 30-plus years would receive an enormous amount of ambient audio from television. News broadcasts, talk shows, advertisements, sports commentary, cultural events. The names and voices of famous people from across 3 decades of popular culture, absorbed passively through the fog of unconsciousness and processed by a dreaming brain into characters in its ongoing simulation. Every guest star who appears in Springfield is someone Homer heard on the television, mounted to the wall of his hospital room. The brain recognized the voice, matched it to a name from memory or from repeated exposure, and found a way to incorporate the person into the dream narrative. Not accurately, not in any way that the actual person would recognize as a faithful depiction, but with enough of the essential texture, the voice, the cultural associations, the public persona, to create a character that feels continuous with what Homer's dreaming mind recognizes as the real person. This also explains why the show's relationship with celebrity guests changes across the decades. Early on, guest appearances are relatively rare and tend to be deeply integrated into the episode's emotional logic. Later, they become more frequent, more briefly integrated, more loosely attached to the episode's themes. The early guest appearances feel like Homer's brain working hard to build them meaningfully into the dream. The later ones feel like Homer's brain receiving more input than it can carefully process, incorporating fragments faster and less carefully. The pattern holds if the coma theory is correct. The early integration of guest appearances reflects a brain still capable of complex narrative construction. The later, fragmented approach reflects a brain doing its best with declining capacity. There is one more element of the theory that deserves sustained attention, because it tends to get overlooked in favor of the more dramatic elements about Homer's family. The show's relationship with death. In Springfield, characters die and return with a casualness that goes beyond cartoon convention. Hans Moleman, as we will discuss, dies repeatedly in canonical episodes and keeps coming back. Minor characters are killed in one episode and present in the next with no explanation. Even significant deaths are sometimes reversed or recontextualized in ways that undermine their permanence. The coma theory explains this more cleanly than any other framework. In Homer's dream, death is not permanent, because Homer's unconscious mind cannot generate a consistent accounting of who is alive and who is not across a decades-long continuous dream. The brain that is generating Springfield does not have a reliable database of the fictional population's vital status. It generates whoever it needs for a given scene, and when it no longer needs them, it releases them until they are needed again. From the outside, this looks like inconsistent continuity. From the inside of the coma theory, it looks like exactly what extended unconscious dreaming produces in a brain that is managing an enormous continuous simulation with limited and declining resources. The dead come back in Homer's dream not because Springfield has special rules about death, though perhaps it does for other reasons. They come back because Homer's brain cannot reliably track who died and when. The unconscious mind holds the people Homer loves and knew with enormous fidelity, preserving them at the moment of the coma, keeping them vivid and present. The peripheral characters, the Momans and the Barney Gumbles and the dozens of one-scene figures who populate Springfield's background, exist with much less structural commitment. They can be generated, used, released, and generated again without the dreaming brain registering the inconsistency. Homer's mind saves its fidelity for Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, for the people who matter most, for the family that is the whole reason the dream exists. Everyone else in Springfield is there to fill the space around them, and the dream is not very careful about tracking their continuity because they are not the reason Homer is still dreaming. He is dreaming because of the family. The family is why the dream does not stop. Expansion for Section 3. Who shot Mr. Burns? Let's approach the evidence from a different angle and consider what the shooting of Mr. Burns means for the power dynamics of Springfield itself. Burns had committed, in the span of a single season, what might be the most comprehensive assault on a single community's well-being that any character in American television comedy has ever orchestrated. He stole a school's income. He destroyed a bar. He collapsed a retirement home. He injured a dog. He blocked the sun. He fired his most loyal employee. All of it calculated, all of it deliberate, all of it in service of a plan to monetize his neighbor's basic need for light and electricity. The shooting is often discussed as a whodunit mystery, and the forensic elements of that mystery are genuinely interesting. But the shooting is also, within Springfield's social history, a political event. It is the moment at which one man pushed a community far enough that someone in that community decided to respond with violence. The question of who did it is interesting. The question of what it means that it happened at all is equally interesting and rarely discussed. Springfield's population accepts an enormous amount from Burns. Over the course of the series, he commits dozens of acts that in any functioning democratic community would generate immediate and sustained organized opposition. He poisons the water. He fires workers capriciously. He buys elections. He bribes officials. He manipulates the media. He pursues personal vendettas with the resources of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And the community, episode after episode, absorbs all of it and returns to a state of relative equilibrium without mounting any organized challenge to his authority. The summer of the shooting was different. Burns went too far in a specific way that managed to make the damage personal and vivid to every single person in Springfield simultaneously. You can abstract corporate pollution. You can rationalize economic exploitation. You can accommodate the 1,000 ordinary daily injuries that powerful institutions inflict on powerless communities, because each one is individually manageable and collectively exhausting to fight. But you cannot abstract the sun being stolen. That is immediate. That is physical. That lands on everyone in the same moment. So, someone shot him. The mystery the show created is about identity, but the political reality the shooting represents is about threshold. Even Springfield, even a population whose critical thinking has been compromised by decades of environmental contamination and whose economic dependency on Burns makes organized opposition financially suicidal, even this community has a line: Burns found it. The mystery of who pulled the trigger may be unresolved. The fact that the trigger was pulled is its own kind of answer to a different question, and Burns' survival changes everything. He wakes from his coma, he identifies the shooter, the case is closed, officially, and within a short period, everything in Springfield returns to normal. Burns retains his wealth, his plant, his power. The sunblocker is gone. Springfield gets its light back, and the community that was briefly mobilized to the point of violence settles back into the familiar equilibrium of endurance without challenge. The shooting changed nothing about the structure of Springfield. It was the one moment when the system came closest to breaking, and even then, even with every single person in town holding a grievance and the richest man in the community bleeding on a sundial, the system survived. Burns survived. And the town went back to work. That is perhaps the most honest thing the shooting arc tells you about Springfield. The moment of maximum crisis, the moment when every condition for genuine systemic change was present, resolved into a mystery instead of a revolution. The energy that should have reorganized the community dissipated into a whodunit, into a courtroom procedural, into a DNA test and a coma victim's testimony. And then, it was over. Someone shot Mr. Burns. And Burns was fine. And Springfield was fine. And nothing changed. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history is less about who pulled the trigger and more about why pulling the trigger accomplished nothing. Now consider the gun itself from a different angle. Burns carried a firearm. The richest man in Springfield carried a loaded weapon on his person when he went to a public meeting to confront a community he had systematically exploited. That detail gets absorbed into the mystery of how the gun ended up being used against him, but consider what it says about Burns's model of how the world works. Burns did not attend the town meeting unarmed because he expected trouble and wanted protection. Burns attended the town meeting armed because Burns moves through the world as someone who assumes he may need to enforce his will at any moment. The gun is not a defensive measure for a man who has private security, who has political protection, who has an infrastructure of institutional support that insulates him from ordinary accountability. The gun is a philosophical statement. Burns carries it because he is the kind of man who believes that the ultimate foundation of his authority is the capacity for violence, and he wants that capacity on his person at all times. The gun falling from his holster and being used against him is a kind of poetic justice that the show drops into the mystery without emphasizing it. The weapon Burns brought to intimidate a community was the same weapon used to shoot him. Whatever your theory about who ultimately pulled the trigger, that irony is embedded in the structure of the event. And there is one more thread in the mystery worth following: the DNA evidence. An eyelash found on Burns's suit tested as belonging to a Simpson. Homer was the suspect this evidence pointed toward. The narrative's subsequent turn toward Maggie was made possible by the claim that Maggie is also a Simpson, and therefore also a match for this particular eyelash. But that reasoning has a gap. The eyelash placed a specific Simpson at close physical proximity to Burns. Not the Simpson family in general. A specific individual who was in contact with Burns in a way that left an eyelash on his suit. Homer and Maggie are both Simpsons, but Maggie is an infant who does not shed eyelashes onto adult men's suits in the normal course of interactions. Homer is a full-sized adult man who was angry at Burns, who was at the same meeting, who had the same level of opportunity, and who subsequently made an uninvestigated confession. The eyelash points to Homer. The show used the fact of Maggie also being a Simpson to redirect the evidence without actually addressing what that eyelash means. The DNA pointed at someone. The someone it pointed at most directly was Homer. And Homer, in a later season, said out loud that he did it. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one, and in Springfield, the simplest explanation is always the one everybody agrees not to investigate. Expansion for Section 4. Burns' immortality. The question of what it means to be too expensive to die deserves more exploration than the elegant phrase alone provides. Consider what Burns has built across over a century of sustained operation. He did not inherit a complete empire and simply maintain it. The Burns that appears in the show's present is the product of 100 years of active strategic accumulation. He has made deals. He has broken them. He has identified leverage points in institutions and exploited them. He has cultivated the kind of relationships with political figures, media figures, and regulatory bodies that take decades to build and that survive only through continuous maintenance. He has, in the language of contemporary institutional analysis, made himself indispensable to the systems around him in ways that make removing him more expensive than accommodating him. This is not unusual behavior for extremely wealthy individuals. What is unusual is the timescale. One very rich person can accomplish a great deal in a 40-year career. What Burns has accomplished is what you get when that 40-year career never ends. When the same person, with the same resources, the same strategic intelligence, the same ruthlessness, keeps operating continuously for over a century without succession, without handing power to the next generation, without the discontinuity that human mortality normally introduces into dynastic power. The power of ordinary billionaires is subject to mortality. Their wealth may persist through inheritance, but their personal relationships, their particular expertise in applying leverage to specific systems, their detailed knowledge of where the compromising material is stored and who owes what to whom, all of that dies with them. A new heir, however capable, must spend years re-establishing the tacit agreements and informal dependencies that their predecessor built across a lifetime. The institutional memory is partly transferable and largely not. Burns does not have this limitation. Burns has been accumulating institutional memory for over 100 years. He knows where the bodies are buried, sometimes literally, because he was there when they were buried. He knows which politicians made which compromises, and which regulatory officials accepted, which gifts and which journalists were bought with which access. He has a century of leverage, maintained by the same person who generated it, continuously applicable because the person who holds it never dies. This is the actual source of his power, more than the money, more than the plant. The money and the plant are the visible surface of a power structure whose real foundation is irreplaceable personal knowledge accumulated over an inhuman span of time. And the treatments that maintain his life are not just keeping him alive as an abstract matter of personal survival. They are protecting an irreplaceable institutional asset that cannot be transferred to a successor because no successor can receive a century of accumulated relational intelligence through inheritance or appointment. Burns's longevity is not just personally beneficial, it is structurally necessary for the survival of the system he has built, which is itself structurally necessary for the survival of Springfield, which means Springfield has every institutional interest in Burns's continued existence, even as Burns has been demonstrably poisoning it for the entirety of his tenure. The town cannot afford to let him die, and he cannot afford to die, and the radiation keeps leaking, and the water stays contaminated, and the system preserves itself because the system was designed by someone who has had 100 years to think about how to make a system self-preserving. There is a specific episode that illustrates the depth of Burns's institutional entrenchment in a way the show does not fully develop, but that rewards attention. At one point in the series, Springfield's government briefly considers regulatory action against the power plant, an environmental review or a compliance audit of some kind. The action is introduced as a storyline, builds through the expected procedural beats, and then quietly collapses, not because Burns defeats it through any dramatic act. It collapses because the people who would need to conduct it, at every level of the local and state governmental structure, have a relationship with Burns that makes conducting it genuinely career-threatening. Not through overt threat, through the simple institutional reality that Burns has been involved in appointing, funding, and maintaining the careers of almost every official who would need to participate in any oversight action against him. This is how regulatory capture actually works in practice. It is not usually a villain sitting behind a desk and issuing explicit threats. It is a web of professional relationships, career dependencies, and informal obligations so extensive and so old that the instinct to take action against the central node of the web is suppressed before it rises to the level of conscious decision. People in the web do not decide not to pursue Burns. They simply never quite get around to it, because the institutional environment makes getting around to it feel costly in ways that are difficult to articulate and impossible to challenge. Burns built that web over a century. He understands it better than anyone, because he was the one who wove it. And the treatments keep him alive to maintain it. Expansion for Section 5, Principal and Pauper. The episode's reception by the fan community reveals something interesting about the audience's own relationship with comfortable fictions. The fans were furious about the principal and the pauper. They objected that the episode violated established continuity. They argued that the reveal that Skinner was Tamsarian was a disrespectful act toward a character who had been carefully developed over 8 seasons. They said it broke their investment in Springfield because it revealed that what they thought they knew about the town was not true. What they were experiencing was the cognitive dissonance of discovering that something they had accepted as stable was not stable, that the identity they had attributed to a character was a construction built on a fiction, that the continuity they believed they were watching was itself a kind of collective agreement to treat a simulation as real. Sound familiar? The fan community's reaction to the Tamsarian reveal mirrors exactly what the citizens of Springfield would have experienced if, instead of voting to maintain the lie, they had voted to confront it. The loss of a comfortable story. The disorienting discovery that the character you had built a relationship with across years of watching was not who you thought they were. The anger at the mechanism that produced the deception. The desire to put the story back the way it was and agree not to mention what you just found out. The fans voted, in their own way, to maintain the comfortable version of Skinner. They rejected the reveal. They categorized the episode as bad, as a betrayal, as something to be skipped. They reinstated the fiction by simply refusing to integrate the truth into their understanding of the character. Skinner is Skinner. The other thing did not happen. It is a bad episode. We don't count it. Springfield did the same thing. The fans did the same thing. Which is perhaps the most meta-textual joke the show has ever made. An episode about a community choosing comfortable lies over inconvenient truth, and the audience's response to that episode was itself to choose the comfortable lie over the inconvenient truth. The show told the audience something true about how communities work. The audience rejected the truth because it was uncomfortable. And the symmetry between what the Springfield citizens did and what the Simpsons audience did went largely unnoticed, because noticing it would require exactly the kind of self-reflection that the episode was suggesting neither Springfield nor its audience was very good at. Now consider what the Tamsarian situation means for the secondary characters of Springfield. If the principal of the elementary school is not who he claims to be, if his entire career, his credentials, his relationships, his authority are built on a stolen identity, what does that imply about the other people who occupy positions of institutional authority in the town? Wiggum as police chief, Mayor Quimby, the various Springfield elementary teachers, the school board members, the local judges, including the one who issued the legal decree protecting Tamsarian's fiction. If the town has demonstrated a willingness to appoint, accept, and legally protect someone in a major institutional role, regardless of whether that person is genuinely who they claim to be, the same willingness presumably applies across other appointments and other institutions. The decree itself is the thing that should be discussed more often in analyses of this episode. A sitting judge, using the real legal authority of his office, issued a formal decree that a known fraud was the genuine article, and that acknowledging the truth was a criminal offense. The judge used his institutional power not to correct a deception, but to encode it into law, to make the lie official, to give it the force of legal protection. That is not a character who is confused about what happened. That is a character who understood exactly what happened and chose to use his legal authority to protect the fiction over the fact. That choice implicates the entire legal infrastructure of Springfield. If the judiciary will issue legal decrees protecting identity fraud because the community finds it more comfortable than the truth, what other comfortable fictions has the Springfield judicial system encoded into law over the years? What legal protections does Burns enjoy because the judge who would have to hear a case against him has a relationship with Burns that makes that hearing professionally inadvisable? What cases have been quietly deflected because the institutional infrastructure that would need to process them has been one relationship at a time, one compromise at a time, over 100 years of Burns's continuous and patient institutional cultivation, made unwilling to process them? The Tamsarian decree is a small, visible instance of a much larger pattern. The judge encoded a specific lie into law on a specific Tuesday in 1997. Burns has been encoding his own larger and more consequential lies into the structures of Springfield's institutions for decades before that, with rather more at stake and rather more resources available to ensure that the encoding holds. Expansion for Section 6. Maggie's silence. There is a moment in The Longest Daycare that tends to be discussed in terms of its emotional resonance, but that rewards analysis for what it reveals about Maggie's strategic intelligence. At one point during her effort to protect the caterpillar, Maggie encounters an obstacle that she cannot immediately solve. She sits with the problem. She does not immediately attempt the most obvious solution, which would likely fail. She pauses. She assesses. She considers the environment, the positions of the other actors in the space, the timing constraints she is working within, and the resources available to her. And then she executes a solution that is not the most obvious one, but is the most effective one, given the specific parameters of the situation. That is not problem solving. That is strategic planning under constraints. It involves a layer of metacognition, thinking about thinking, evaluating approaches before committing to them, that most adults do not consciously engage in even when they are capable of it. Maggie is doing this reflexively, naturally, as a matter of course. The people around her are not capable of the same thing. The other babies in the facility, including Gerald the bully, operate on a much more immediate and reactive level. They see a thing and try to get it or stop it. Maggie sees the same thing and models the system around it before she acts. The gap in cognitive processing is visible in every sequence of action the short depicts. And none of the adults in the facility notice this, because they are not watching Maggie. They are watching the environment they expect to have to manage, which is the environment of young children doing young children things. Maggie stays below their threshold of attention because she has calibrated her behavior to stay below that threshold. Her occasional visible moves are framed within the context of normal infant behavior. Her genuine cognitive processing happens in the gaps, in the quiet moments when she is apparently just sitting and watching. She is always watching. The show has depicted Maggie absorbing vast amounts of information across its run, without any visible indication that the information is being processed or retained. She sits in the living room while the family has conversations that are well above the vocabulary level of any ordinary one-year-old. She is present during crises, during discussions of serious family matters, during moments when Homer and Marge reveal things to each other that they, perhaps, would not say in front of someone who was listening carefully. She attends these moments silently. The family does not modify their behavior because they have unconsciously categorized Maggie as non-threatening, non-absorbing, not really there in the sense that matters for these conversations. Maggie takes everything in. Everything. She knows things about this family that the family members themselves have never articulated to each other. She has heard Homer's vulnerabilities laid bare in moments of crisis. She has observed Marge's private exhaustion in moments when Marge thought the children were asleep. She has watched Bart in the specific way that only a silent, attentive observer can watch someone, seeing things about her brother that even Lisa, who is much closer to Bart in age and relationship, probably does not see with the same clarity. She has been accumulating this information for 36 years. The strategic intelligence she demonstrated in the daycare situation was not a one-time performance. It is her baseline. It is how she operates. All the time, in every context. The daycare simply happened to be a context in which the stakes were clear enough and the sequence was compressed enough that an observer could follow the full arc of her decision-making from beginning to end. In the ongoing context of the Simpson household, her strategic intelligence is operating continuously and at a much larger scale, but it is invisible because the time frame is too extended for a casual observer to perceive the coherence of her actions across episodes and situations. Think about what it means to have been present in a family for 36 years, absorbing every conversation, observing every dynamic, building an ever more sophisticated model of how each person in the family operates and what their vulnerabilities and strengths are, without ever being asked to account for any of what you know, without ever having been put in a position where revealing what you know would be necessary or beneficial, without ever triggering in the people around you the defensive awareness that someone knows more about them than they realize. Maggie is the most comprehensively informed person in Springfield, and she has maintained that informational advantage through 3.5 decades of studied invisibility. The pacifier is important here in a way that is easy to overlook. The pacifier is the visual anchor of Maggie's infant performance. It is the prop that most clearly signals to observers that she is a baby, that she is in an early developmental stage, that she is fundamentally pre-verbal and pre-strategic. As long as the pacifier is present and in motion, the baby signal is active. As long as the baby signal is active, people around Maggie engage with her in the mode appropriate for interacting with an infant, which means reduced attention, reduced linguistic complexity, reduced strategic wariness. The pacifier is not a comfort object, it is a costume piece. Maggie chooses when she keeps it in and when she takes it out with a care that becomes visible if you watch her across episodes looking for it. In moments of active strategic engagement, it tends to be present, keeping the baby signal on while she works. In moments of private assessment, in moments when she has confirmed she is unobserved, it sometimes shifts in ways that suggest it is not fixed permanently, but is a prop she manages. The trigger-mimicking movement at the end of the Burns episode was performed without the pacifier. She took it out to make that gesture in private, and then, presumably, she put it back in. Expansion for Section 7. Predictions. The mechanism by which cultural content shapes cultural expectation is not well understood at the level of individual cognition, but it is very well documented at the population level. There is a reason the entertainment industry has always been understood as more than entertainment. There is a reason governments take an interest in what stories their populations consume and what images those stories normalize. Stories tell you what is possible. They tell you what the world can look like. They tell you what kinds of people exist, what kinds of events happen, what kinds of outcomes are achievable. And because much of human decision-making, including political decision-making, is anchored in an implicit model of what is normal and possible rather than in a careful philosophical analysis of what is optimal, the stories that shape that implicit model have real, measurable effects on how decisions are made. The Simpsons has been telling stories about what American life looks like to a larger audience for a longer time than any other single piece of entertainment media in the country's history. It has been running since before the World Wide Web existed as a public phenomenon. It has been running through every major technological, political, and cultural shift of the past 3.5 decades. And through all of it, it has been populating the cultural imagination with specific images, specific narratives, specific visions of what the world can look like. A corrupt local politician who is simultaneously harmless and rapacious. A billionaire who treats his employees as resources to be depleted. A regulatory system that is nominally present but practically toothless. A working-class family that is perpetually economically precarious but never actually destroyed by that precarity. These are not just characters, they are models. They are the shapes that certain types of people and situations take in the cultural imagination of anyone who has watched the show. When a real corrupt politician behaves in ways that resemble Mayor Quimby, the audience has a mental filing cabinet for that behavior. They have seen it before, they have a frame for it, and the frame, having been presented as comedy, has a particular valence. Quimby is corrupt but bumbling, corrupt but survivable, corrupt in a way that is ultimately more absurd than threatening. The show does not intend this as a reassurance about real corruption, but the audience may receive it as one, because the shape of corrupt politicians in their mental model has been formed partly by repeated exposure to Quimby. The same applies to Burns. Burns is evil but cartoonish. Burns is dangerous but ultimately unable to achieve his most ambitious goals. Burns is powerful but beatable, at least within individual episodes, at least temporarily. The show does not intend Burns as a reassurance about real billionaires. But if the dominant cultural representation of the dangerous billionaire is a frail, ancient man who can be knocked over by a stiff breeze and cannot remember his employee's name, the audience's emotional model of what dangerous billionaires are like has been shaped by that representation. This is the deepest version of the prediction phenomenon. The Simpsons does not predict specific events. It populates the cultural imagination with specific categories of person and event in ways that make those categories feel familiar and legible when they materialize in reality. The show does not predict a Trump presidency. It establishes in the cultural imagination a category of celebrity as political figure that, by the time the category manifests in reality, feels recognizable rather than shocking. The audience has seen this before. They know what this kind of thing looks like. They have a frame. The frame is not neutral. The frame shapes the response. And The Simpsons has been building frames for 36 years. This is also why the show's satirical function has become more complicated over time, as the distance between the satire and the thing being satirized has collapsed. Early seasons of the show were satirizing an America that was distinct from Springfield's absurdity. The gap between the world on screen and the world outside was legible and comfortable, and the show could use that gap to generate insight. As American reality has increasingly begun to resemble Springfield in ways that were once clearly satirical, the gap has narrowed. The show is now satirizing an America that in some respects resembles the satire more than the satire resembles the original. which means the show is no longer clearly telling you something about the world. It may simply be describing the world. That is a different thing, and it is uncomfortable in a different way than the prediction phenomenon is uncomfortable. The predictions are alarming because of what they seem to imply about knowledge and foreknowledge. The possibility that The Simpsons has become documentary rather than satire is alarming because of what it implies about the world. Expansion for Section 8. Mona Simpson. The episode Mother Simpson aired at a specific moment in the show's history that is worth noting. Season 7 represented the show at arguably its most emotionally sophisticated. The writers were confident enough in the show's comic infrastructure to let episodes breathe, to allow emotional weight to exist without comedy as its constant companion, to trust the audience to receive something quiet and sad without needing it to be funny. The final image of Mother Simpson is one of the most discussed in the show's history. After the FBI arrives and Mona has to flee again, after Homer has watched his mother leave for the second time in his life, the episode ends on Homer alone on the roof of his house, staring up at the night sky. There is no joke. There is no cutaway. There is no reset. The episode simply ends on a man alone with something that cannot be resolved. It is one of the few moments in 36 seasons of comedy where the show stops trying to be anything other than what the moment requires. And what the moment requires is silence and weight and the acknowledgement that some things that happen to people cannot be fixed within the runtime of a 22-minute episode. Homer's mother is gone again. She was here for an afternoon and she is gone again, and the next episode will not fix that, because some things do not fix. The show earns that ending because it has done the work of Mona's backstory with genuine care. She is not a villain. She is not even a minor character in the pejorative sense. She is a woman who made a choice that the show presents as genuinely difficult to evaluate morally. Was she right to join the activists? The show suggests yes, that Burns's biological weapons program was a real and serious harm being done to real people. Was she right to stop to help Burns when he was knocked down? The show presents this as an instinctive act of human decency that had catastrophic personal consequences. Was Abe right to cover up the truth and make a deal with Burns? The show is more ambivalent about this one, presenting it as a failure of courage with understandable roots in fear. The moral landscape of the Mona episode is more complex than most television comedy is willing to engage with. And the complexity is what makes it endure in a way that funnier episodes sometimes don't. You remember the episodes that ask something of you. You remember the episodes that refuse easy resolution. You remember Mother Simpson because it refuses to tell you how to feel about any of the people in it, including Homer, who is both the victim of this situation and, in his continued employment at Burns's plant, an unwitting instrument of the man who created it. That last detail is the one that hits hardest when you sit with it. Homer has spent his entire adult life making possible, through his daily labor, the continued operation of the facility whose owner destroyed his family, not knowingly, not by choice, but effectively. Every day that Homer shows up to work and does not file the report that would shut the plant down, he is, in some structural sense, enabling the man who took his mother. He cannot see this. The crayon and the radiation and the decades of environmental damage and the psychological devastation of growing up believing your mother chose to leave you have combined to produce a person who cannot make this connection. And Burns, who understands exactly what Homer is and exactly what Homer's damage enables, has made sure that the deal with Grandpa keeps Homer employed in perpetuity. The broken man in Sector 7G is not a coincidence. He is the linchpin. Expansion for Section 9. Where is Springfield? The geographic impossibility of Springfield has a parallel in the way that certain real communities are deliberately designed to resist outside scrutiny. There is a documented phenomenon in environmental justice research of facilities being placed in communities that are not well positioned to mount legal challenges, in geographic or jurisdictional situations that complicate regulatory oversight, or in regions where the relevant regulatory authority is stretched thin enough that comprehensive monitoring is practically impossible. These are not conspiracy theories. They are documented patterns, studied and named and discussed in academic literature and in the reporting of journalists who cover environmental issues. Springfield's geographic ambiguity is an extreme and satirical version of a real phenomenon. Burns benefits from the town's indeterminate location in exactly the ways that real facilities benefit from strategic placement. The difficulty in establishing which state's law applies, which federal regional office has jurisdiction, which elected officials have the clearest accountability for what happens inside the town's borders, All of these difficulties are not accidents of storytelling. They are the precise benefits that geographic ambiguity provides to the power structure that depends on them. The show has also had fun with the impossibility of Springfield's geography in ways that reward close attention. In various episodes, characters have driven to locations that are established as being a day's drive away from Springfield that, geographically, could not both be true simultaneously. The ocean is apparently accessible within a morning's drive. So are the mountains. So is a desert environment. So is a large city that sometimes resembles Chicago, sometimes resembles Los Angeles, sometimes feels like a generic American urban environment with its specific characteristics unspecified. Each individual trip makes sense within the episode. The ocean is there when the episode needs the ocean. The mountains are there when the episode needs mountains. The city is there when a story requires an urban setting. The geographic features of the world around Springfield are responsive to narrative need rather than to any consistent cartographic logic. If Homer is dreaming, this is exactly right. A dream does not have consistent geography. It has geography that responds to the need of the dream. You can drive to the ocean because the dream put the ocean there. You can drive to the mountains because the dream needed mountains for this scene. The geography of the world outside Springfield in Homer's coma is as plastic and responsive as the geography inside any sustained dream because it is the geography of an unconscious mind rather than the geography of an actual place. The fact that Springfield's external geography is as internally inconsistent as Springfield itself suggests that the inconsistency is not limited to the town. Whatever is happening in Springfield is also happening to the world around it. The contamination theory, if extended, might suggest that the effects of the radiation are not limited to the town proper. The coma theory would predict this directly, because the whole world in the coma is the whole world in Homer's dream, and Homer's dream has no obligation to geographic accuracy anywhere. Expansion for Section 10. The floating timeline. There is a deep sadness that runs through the floating timeline, and it is not about the characters, it is about the audience. Everyone who has ever loved The Simpsons has had a childhood or adolescence or young adulthood during which the show was part of the texture of their life. The show was on when they were growing up. The couch gag played, the theme music started, the family came sliding into their positions, and something happened in that moment, some version of comfort or recognition or the pleasure of the familiar that got associated with a particular period of their life. That association is still there. The show is still on. But the person watching it now is not the person who first loved it. The couch that person sat on may be gone. The house they watched from may be gone or changed or occupied by strangers. The people they watched with may have moved away or grown apart or died. Everything that surrounded their original experience of the show is subject to the ordinary attrition of time. The show is not. The Simpsons is still there, exactly as it was, or close enough to exactly as it was that the gap feels irrelevant. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. The house on Evergreen Terrace still looks the same. And when you watch it, you can feel, for the duration of the episode, something that approximates the feeling of being back in the time when you first watched it. Not exactly, but enough. A ghost of it. An approximation. This is what the floating timeline does that nothing else in the culture quite replicates. It provides a stable reference point in a world where everything changes. You can return to Springfield and find it exactly as you left it. No matter how much has changed outside that reference point, Springfield holds. The family holds. The house on Evergreen Terrace holds. We need this. We did not fully understand how much we needed it until the show had been running long enough that the contrast became stark. The world outside Springfield has changed almost unrecognizably across 36 years. The world inside it has not. And the stability of that interior world is not just nostalgically comforting. It is the only fixed point many people have against which to measure the rate and extent of everything else's change. Springfield shows you how fast you have been moving by not moving itself. That is perhaps the most melancholy function the show has ever performed. Not intentionally, not as a creative decision, but as a consequence of existing for long enough that the floating timeline has become less of a narrative convention and more of a philosophical statement. The Simpsons don't age because we don't want them to age. Because we need at least one family to stay exactly as they were. Because if they changed, if the kids grew up and the parents got old and the house on Evergreen Terrace was sold and the family scattered as real families scatter, We would lose the only constant reference point the culture has maintained across the entirety of our adult lives. The show did not set out to be this. It set out to be a comedy. It became this because it kept going, and we kept watching, and 36 years accumulated around it, and somewhere in the accumulation it transformed from a show we watch into a place we return to. That transformation is not something the writers planned. But it is real, and the floating timeline is the mechanism that makes it possible. Because a Springfield that aged would eventually become unrecognizable, and then would become simply another completed thing, another show that ended, another place you cannot return to. The Springfield that does not age is a place that will always be there, whenever you need it, exactly as you remember it, with the family still intact and the house still standing and the beer still cold and the couch still waiting. We built the loop. We keep building it, every time we watch. And in the building of it, we gave ourselves something that the rest of the world cannot provide. A family that stays. A home that never changes. A Sunday night that never ends. That is what the floating timeline really is. Not a narrative convenience. Not a production shortcut. A gift we gave ourselves through the act of sustained collective attention across 36 years of watching the same family on the same couch in the same impossible town. Expansion for Section 11. Molman and Flanders. The Ned Flanders situation has one more layer that the show drops in quietly and never fully develops. His relationship with Homer is not just a comedy dynamic, it is a philosophical proposition. The show has structured Ned and Homer as moral opposites for 36 years. Ned does everything right. Homer does almost everything wrong. Ned is rewarded with suffering. Homer is rewarded with survival and, on some level, with the love of his family despite everything. The universe of Springfield distributes its rewards and punishments with what appears to be, at best, a complete indifference to moral desert. But there is a way to read the Homer-Ned dynamic that is less about moral desert and more about what kinds of people the system actually produces and selects for. Homer is unreliable. Homer is chaotic. Homer cannot be depended on to behave consistently, to follow rules, to stay within any prescribed lane of behavior. He is, as an employee and a citizen and a neighbor, fundamentally unpredictable. But he is also, in his chaos, fundamentally unthreatening to the structure of Springfield's power arrangement. He does not organize. He does not sustain grievances across time. He does not build coalitions. He does not plan anything more than a few minutes ahead. He is a chaos element, but a contained and domesticated chaos element, one that dissipates energy into immediate reaction rather than sustained organized opposition. Ned is reliable. Ned is consistent. Ned can be depended on to behave predictably, to follow rules, to stay in his assigned lane. He is, as an employee and a citizen and a neighbor, the model Springfield resident in terms of institutional compliance. But he is also, in his consistency and his reliability, potentially more dangerous to the existing power structure than Homer is. Ned has the cognitive capacity and the sustained self-discipline to organize, to plan, to build towards something over time, to convert his grievances into action. He simply does not do these things, because his conditioning prevents him from acknowledging the grievances fully enough to act on them. The system of Springfield has, in a sense, the perfect arrangement. The chaotic element is harmless because it dissipates. The capable element is harmless because it is psychologically caged. And between the two of them, they represent the full range of Springfield's population. People who would act but can't plan, and people who can plan but are prevented from acting. Burns sits above this. Burns watches this. Burns has, very possibly, understood this dynamic for decades, and the specific arrangements he has made, including the arrangement with Grandpa that keeps Homer employed, and the various mechanisms that have made Ned's neighborhood presence a constant reminder of the rewards of compliance, may have been designed with this dynamic in mind. Homer and Ned are not a comedy duo. They are a proof of concept for the system of control that Burns has spent a century perfecting. The broken man and the caged man, living side by side on the same street, each one containing the other's potential for disruption by their very existence. And God talks to Homer. That is not incidental. In the show's own internal theology, the divine communicates with Homer and not with Ned. The drunk, the failure, the man who sleeps through church gets the face-to-face conversations. The devout, the disciplined, the man who has organized his entire existence around the cultivation of virtue gets silence. The show has different ways of reading this. One reading is that God communicates with Homer because Homer is funny and the show is a comedy, and God appearing to Homer generates better material than God appearing to Ned. That is probably the production-level explanation. But within the world of the show, within the internal logic of Springfield, the theological dispensation creates a specific social reality. Faith, as a mechanism for bearing suffering, works less well than it should for the person who needs it most, and depends on it most completely, which is Ned. Homer does not need faith. Homer does not need a framework that makes suffering meaningful, because Homer does not retain his suffering from episode to episode. The reset button saves Homer from the cumulative weight of his experiences. He does not need theological comfort because he does not accumulate theological need. Ned accumulates everything. Ned remembers, Ned carries, and the God that could provide comfort for all that carrying seems to prefer conversations with the man who will forget them by next week. That is Springfield, that is the system. That is the way the town works for everyone who lives in it, right down to what kind of relationship with the divine you can expect to maintain based on where you fall in the social and psychological taxonomy that Burns built and the radiation sustained and the collective denial maintains. The devout man gets silence, the drunk gets company, and nobody asks why. Expansion for Section 12. Everything connects. Let's sit with the most important convergence that we have not named directly yet. Every theory in this video describes a mechanism by which the residents of Springfield are prevented from understanding their own situation. The radiation damages the cognition that would allow for critical analysis. The coma makes the dream town incapable of self-awareness by definition, because a dream cannot analyze itself from the inside. The collective denial mechanism socially punishes anyone who approaches the truth. The Burns institutional system economically punishes anyone who challenges it. Tamsarian Springfield criminalizes the statement of truth. Every single theory arrives at the same structural conclusion. Springfield's residents are trapped in a situation they cannot perceive clearly enough to understand, and cannot understand clearly enough to change. The mechanism differs by theory. The outcome is the same. This convergence is either evidence that all the theories are pointing at a single real thing, or it is evidence that the theories are all expressions of the same underlying anxiety about the show. Both possibilities are worth taking seriously. If the theories are pointing at a real thing, then what they are pointing at is the show's deepest subject matter, which has nothing to do with Homer's stupidity or Mr. Burns's immortality or even the nuclear plant's violations. The show's deepest subject matter is the question of why people cannot see what is happening to them, and what the mechanisms are that prevent that perception, and what it would cost to break through them. The Simpsons has been asking this question for 36 years. It has been asking it through comedy, through character, through the accumulated weight of hundreds of episodes depicting a population that cannot quite see what is directly in front of them. And the question has remained relevant because the world outside Springfield has not answered it either. Why do people have so much difficulty perceiving the systems that shape their lives? Why do communities accept things that they would, individually, and in moments of clear reflection, identify as harmful? Why does the person in Sector 7G keep showing up to work for the man who stole his childhood? Why does the man with the most obvious legitimate grievance respond with forgiveness that is indistinguishable from passivity? Why does the town choose the lie every time? The Simpsons does not answer these questions. It depicts them with extraordinary precision and consistency, and it trusts the audience to sit with them, and it has been doing so for longer than most of its audience has been alive. The show is not a solution. It is a portrait of the problem, rendered in yellow and four-fingered precision, repeated every week for 36 years. And the theories, all of them, are the audience's attempt to answer the question the show keeps asking. Is it the radiation? Is it the dream? Is it the denial? Is it the deal? What is keeping these people from being able to see what is happening to them? The theories are not curiosities or fan games. They are the audience doing the work that the show invites without explicitly requesting. They are people who could not let the question sit unanswered, and who found the pattern under the surface interesting enough to stay with. They found in the attempt to explain Springfield that the explanation illuminated something beyond Springfield. The theories converge because the question underneath them is a single question. And the single question has been sitting in the middle of American television's longest-running show since the first episode aired in December 1989. Hidden in plain sight, The way everything in Springfield is hidden in plain sight, because the orange cones of comedy deflect attention from it without actually obscuring it. The show is not hiding the question. It is asking it every week. It is waiting for someone to answer. Closing extended outro. You have been in Springfield for a very long time tonight. Longer than any single episode, longer than any single season, longer than most people stay with any one thing in a world that has been designed to move quickly from one thing to the next. That length of time is itself something. The Simpsons has a gravitational pull that is difficult to explain in terms of individual quality or specific achievement. Episodes of other shows are better, funnier, more emotionally sophisticated, more formally innovative. Other shows have done things that The Simpsons cannot do because The Simpsons is working within constraints that those shows chose not to accept. The floating timeline constrains what stories can be told. The yellow skin and the four fingers constrain how the characters can be read. The comedy framing constrains how much emotional weight the audience will accept without pushing back. And yet, 36 years, nearly 800 episodes, more total hours of content than most humans will spend in deliberate engagement with any single creative work across their entire lives. The show endures because it has found a way to be present across every phase of a human life. You can watch it as a child and find Bart's pranks funny. You can watch it as a teenager and find the social satire pointed. You can watch it as a young adult and begin to notice what the show is saying about economic anxiety and institutional power. You can watch it as a parent and feel the emotional weight of Homer's love for his family in a way that was not accessible to you before you had children. You can watch it as someone who has lost things and feel the loss that runs under the comedy like a river under ice. The show meets you wherever you are. Not because it is designed that way, not through any deliberate artistic calculation, but because it has been running long enough and saying enough true things about human experience that its content has inevitably accumulated the range to reach people at any point in their lives. That is the rarest thing a piece of art can achieve. Not excellence at a single moment, but relevance across a span of time long enough that the audience grows into and through it. The Simpsons is not a great show in the way that a perfectly constructed season of television is great. It is something different. It is a great ongoing project of cultural attention, sustained across decades, imperfect in execution, uneven in quality, frequently maddening in its relationship to its own continuity, but honest in a way that cannot be faked across that length of time. The conspiracies and the theories and the mysteries we have explored tonight are all ways of paying the show the attention it has earned. They are ways of saying that there is more here than the comedy and that the more deserves to be named and examined. They are ways of sitting with the show long enough to see what is underneath the surface and asking what it means. Whatever is really happening in Springfield, whether it is radiation, or dream, or denial, or institutional corruption, or some combination that the theories have not yet managed to fully articulate, the show has been honest about it from the beginning. The truth has always been there. Every yellow face, every three-eyed fish, every impossible recovery, every forgotten disaster, every time the credits rolled and everything went back to normal. The show was never hiding it. We were. And now it is late, and the night is very quiet, and Springfield is still there, waiting on the other side of whatever screen you have fallen asleep in front of. Bart is still 10 years old. Lisa is still 8. Homer is somewhere near Sector 7G, probably asleep at his console, failing upward in the way he has always failed upward, sustained by a system that needs him exactly as damaged and exactly as devoted as he has always been. And Maggie is watching. She is always watching. Sleep well. We will be here when you come back. That is the whole point. End of expansion content. Final expansion, additional depth for key sections. Additional content for Section 1. There is a specific kind of environmental harm that is discussed in public health literature as chronic low-level exposure, and it is distinct from the acute catastrophic events that tend to dominate media coverage of environmental disasters. Acute events are visible. They have a moment of onset. They have immediate, undeniable consequences that force institutions to respond. The 3 Mile Island accident was acute. Chernobyl was acute. The explosion at Fukushima was acute. Chronic low-level exposure is different. It has no moment of onset. It has no single catastrophic event that forces attention. It accumulates slowly, invisibly, in ways that are difficult to attribute to a single source because the effects appear gradually and are distributed across a population rather than concentrated at a single point of impact. The harm is real, and in aggregate it may be far greater than the harm from acute events, but it is structurally designed to evade the response mechanisms that societies have developed for dealing with environmental danger. The Springfield nuclear power plant is the satirical apotheosis of chronic low-level exposure as an institutional strategy. The violations are real, documented, and ongoing, but they are not individually catastrophic in the way that would force an acute response. The chewing gum on the cooling tower crack is not the same as a reactor explosion. The luminous rats are not the same as a radioactive cloud spreading over a city. The contaminated river water is not the same as a visible toxic spill. Each individual violation is absurd, but each individual violation is also deniable, manageable, a matter for regulatory negotiation rather than emergency response. Burns has built an operation that is always one step below the threshold of unambiguous catastrophe, always in violation, always in negotiation, always presenting its violations as individual items to be assessed and addressed in due course, rather than as a cumulative pattern that adds up to something that should not be permitted to continue operating. This is not unique to fiction. This is how many chronic environmental harms are sustained in the real world. The pattern is documented. The mechanism is understood by anyone who has studied environmental law and regulatory enforcement. The show is not inventing a conspiracy. It is depicting, in satirical form, a mechanism that exists. The satirical form is what makes it bearable to watch. If The Simpsons had been produced as a realistic drama about a working-class family living in the shadow of a chronically unsafe nuclear facility whose owner had enough political influence to evade regulatory accountability, it would be unwatchable. Not because the content would be untrue, but because the true content would be too heavy to sustain a weekly audience for 36 years. The comedy is not a disguise. It is a delivery mechanism. It makes the content accessible. It makes the pattern recognizable without being paralyzing. It gives the audience a way to receive information about how these systems actually work without activating the psychological defense mechanisms that tend to shut down attention when the topic becomes too directly threatening. Homer falling asleep at the safety console is funny. Homer falling asleep at the safety console is also a very accurate depiction of what happens when safety inspector positions are filled through political and economic arrangement rather than competence assessment. The joke and the truth inhabit the same space simultaneously, and the joke is what lets the truth stay in the room long enough for the audience to absorb it. Additional content for Section 3. One element of the Burns shooting mystery that deserves extended consideration is the function of Chief Wiggum's investigation, not as a comedy of police incompetence, but as a structural feature of the Springfield power arrangement. Wiggum is depicted throughout the series as comprehensively incompetent. He is slow, poorly informed, easily distracted, more concerned with donuts and football than with the actual work of law enforcement. His investigations typically fail on their own terms. His department solves crimes, when it solves them at all, through accident and coincidence rather than through any systematic application of investigative technique. This is comedy. Wiggum is a comedy character, but the incompetence of Springfield's law enforcement is also, within the logic of the radiation theory and the Burns institutional theory, a structural requirement. A genuinely competent police department in Springfield would create real problems for Burns. Effective investigation of crimes would sometimes implicate Burns or his operations. Consistent application of laws would sometimes catch violations at the plant. A police department that actually investigated things would be incompatible with the arrangement Burns has built. So the police department is not competent. This may or may not be Burns's doing directly. The show does not establish that Burns deliberately hired an incompetent police chief, or that he has formal arrangements with Wiggum of the kind he has with other Springfield officials. But the systemic outcome, a law enforcement apparatus that poses no threat to the existing power structure, is consistent with what you would expect from a community where that power structure has had a century to shape the institutional environment to its requirements. The investigation into the Burns shooting proceeds exactly as an investigation run by Wiggum would proceed. Evidence is mishandled. Confessions are accepted and then abandoned. The forensic logic is applied sloppily. The conclusion is reached not through systematic elimination of suspects and careful evaluation of the remaining evidence, but through the convenience of Burns waking up and naming someone. And the person Burns names is a baby. Wiggum says the investigation is complete. A baby did it. Case closed. The investigation ends not because the evidence has been definitively evaluated, but because the conclusion is convenient. A baby cannot be prosecuted. The case can be closed. Burns is awake and apparently not pursuing further action. The file can be put away. The Burns shooting investigation is the principal and the pauper situation in forensic form. The official conclusion is reached not because it is the most defensible conclusion from the evidence, but because it is the conclusion that closes the case most cleanly, and without the kind of ongoing inquiry that might produce uncomfortable discoveries. Wiggum is not corrupt in the way that requires explicit instruction. He is, in the truest sense, a convenience. A man who closes files because open files are uncomfortable, and whose incompetence is so thoroughgoing that he could not successfully investigate a conspiracy even if he wanted to. Which is precisely what makes him useful in the arrangement that Springfield has become. Additional content for Section 6. Maggie expanded. One aspect of Maggie's situation that connects most directly to the other major theories is her relationship with time. Maggie is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. In the radiation theory, her body's aging is suppressed by the same environmental contamination that suppresses everyone else's aging. But where that suppression reads as a kind of preservation in the adults, in Maggie it reads as something more unusual. She is perpetually in the stage of life that precedes language, that precedes independent mobility, that precedes the social legibility that language and mobility together provide. She is frozen at the threshold, not before cognition, as her intelligence demonstrates, but before the moment at which cognition becomes socially legible through speech and through the capacity for autonomous movement that allows her to be a visible actor in the world, rather than a passive observer carried from location to location. The freezing of the Springfield population generally means that the adults are frozen in their competencies and their relationships. Homer will always be in the mode of a mid-30s working-class father with specific patterns of thinking and responding. Marge will always be at the particular stage of patience and worry and love that characterizes this specific phase of her life. Burns will always be the ancient, strategic, medically sustained patriarch. For Maggie, the freeze means something different. She is perpetually in the developmental stage that precedes full social participation. She is perpetually in the stage where she is being carried rather than walking, observed rather than heard, present rather than active. In a community of people frozen at their particular life stages, Maggie is the only person frozen at a stage where she is, by developmental convention, not yet a fully counted member of the community. This gives her a freedom that nobody else in Springfield has. She is present everywhere and nowhere. She is noticed as furniture and ignored as an agent. She is carried to events and conversations that are not meant for her ears, because her ears are not assumed to be doing what they are actually doing. The radiation has frozen everyone in Springfield. For most residents, being frozen means being trapped. For Maggie, being frozen at the most invisible stage of human life means being protected from the visibility that traps everyone else. And she has had 36 years to take advantage of it. Additional content for Section 10. There is a specific version of the floating timeline problem that affects the show's relationship with grief in a way that is rarely discussed. On the occasions when The Simpsons depicts genuine loss, when someone dies or a significant relationship ends or something changes in a way that should permanently alter the landscape of the show's emotional world, the floating timeline creates a specific tension. The loss is real within the episode. It is depicted with weight and care. And then the next episode begins and the change has not propagated. The world is as it was. The loss is either mentioned in passing or not mentioned at all, and the show's emotional register returns to its default configuration. This is technically a consequence of episodic storytelling conventions rather than anything specific to The Simpsons. But The Simpsons has been doing it for long enough, and has occasionally depicted losses significant enough that the pattern has become its own kind of statement. Maude Flanders's death was meant to be permanent. The show did not pull it back. Maude stayed dead. But the emotional consequences for Ned, for his sons, for his relationship with Homer and the rest of the neighborhood, while explored in the immediate aftermath, have not continued to be the dominant texture of his life, in the way a real person's life would be shaped for years by such a loss. The floating timeline absorbs even real permanence and eventually deposits it back into the default configuration. Homer's mother died. That was real and it stayed real. But the texture of Homer's life in the episodes following her death was not perceptibly different from the texture of his life before she returned. The hole her loss made in his emotional landscape was acknowledged in the episode and then gradually recovered by the show's need to return to its operational normal. What this means for the theories. In the coma theory, the absorption of real loss back into emotional normal is exactly what a dreaming mind does. It acknowledges the loss in the dream because the dreaming brain has received information that a loss has occurred, and it generates the appropriate emotional response, which is grief and weight. But then the dream cannot sustain that alteration indefinitely because the dreaming brain does not have the sustained processing capacity to maintain a fundamentally changed emotional landscape across an extended period. The dream returns to the configuration that feels like home because that is what the dreaming brain knows best. The world as it was on the day Homer went to sleep. In the collective denial theory, the emotional returns to normal because the community around the grief supports and gently insists upon the return. Springfield is not a community that sustains mourning. It is a community that accommodates mourning briefly and then expects the return to function. The social pressure is not cruel. It is simply the ordinary expectation of a community that needs its members operating in their usual roles, which is not compatible with indefinite grief. Both theories describe something true about how communities actually handle loss, which is one of the reasons The Simpsons, despite being a comedy, has accumulated such a strange authority as a document of how human beings actually move through the world. It keeps depicting things accurately even when accuracy is uncomfortable. Even when accuracy requires depicting the emotional abandonment of grief that communities inflict on their members, not through cruelty but simply through the ordinary pressure of continuing to exist. End of final expansion. Final additional passages. For Section 2. More on the dream. There is something almost poetic about the specific episode that houses the coma, April Fool's Day. The holiday built on the premise that what appears to be true is not, that the surface reality is a construction designed to deceive, that the reveal will come, and the real situation will be different from what you were led to believe. Homer enters his coma on April Fool's Day, which is either a coincidence or the show's most elegant piece of long-form irony, depending on how seriously you take the theory. The pranks that led to the hospital were Bart's. Bart, his son, the mischievous child who represents a particular version of unruly masculine energy and impulsive creativity. It was Bart's prank that put Homer in the hospital. And it is Bart, tearfully confessing at Homer's bedside, who is present at the moment Homer supposedly wakes up. In the coma theory, that confession is the last real thing Homer hears before the dream fully takes over. His son weeping, saying that it was his fault. Homer's unconscious brain incorporated that moment. It became the template for the Bart-Homer relationship in the dream. The son who causes trouble, who goes too far, who genuinely loves his father underneath the chaos, and the father who forgives him every time because forgiveness is easier than the alternative, which is acknowledging that what happened in the hospital was real, and that the son's impulsiveness had real and permanent consequences. Every strangling, every exasperated paternal reaction to Bart's behavior, every moment of Homer being pushed to his limit by his son, and then pulling back from the edge and finding something that resembles warmth underneath the frustration, all of it is the dream's processing of that bedside confession. Bart said it was his fault. The dream has been working through that admission for 30 years. Every episode in which Homer is angry at Bart and then relents is the dream's ongoing negotiation with the guilt and love and complicated forgiveness of that moment. The dream cannot resolve it because the dreaming brain cannot achieve the psychological closure that would let it move on. So it keeps running the scenario. Bart transgresses. Homer reacts. The transgression turns out to be more innocent than it appeared. Or the love underneath the anger reasserts itself. Or some external threat reminds them both of what matters. The story ends with the family intact. And then it begins again. 30 years of that same loop, the same negotiation, the same incomplete resolution, the same beginning of the next iteration. Because the dreaming brain cannot achieve closure, and because closure is the only thing that would let the dream end, the dream does not end. It runs. It keeps running. It will keep running for as long as Homer's brain can sustain it. That is perhaps the most beautiful and the most heartbreaking thing about the coma theory in the end. Homer's dream is not just about holding onto his family, it is about holding onto his son, about working through, in an infinite loop, the moment when his son's impulsiveness changed everything, and finding a way, every episode, every 30 minutes, to arrive at a version of the ending where they are still okay, where Bart still loves him, where the family is still intact, where the fool's joke did not break anything that cannot be fixed. The dream is a negotiation that never ends because it cannot end. Homer needs it not to end, and so it doesn't. For Section 11, Extended Moleman. There is a fan theory that exists at the margins of the Moleman discussion that is too interesting to leave unmentioned. It proposes that Hans Moleman is not a minor background character at all, but the single most important figure in Springfield's hidden history. A man whose age of 31, taken seriously, implies that he was born roughly in the late 1980s or early 1990s, which would mean that the catastrophic physical aging he has undergone represents an acceleration of biological time that is completely unprecedented in the show's universe. If Moleman is actually 31 and appears to be in his 80s or 90s, the rate of his biological aging is somewhere between 2 and 3 times normal human rate. Not a slight acceleration. A dramatic compression of biological time. The radiation theory accounts for this. Certain types of radiation exposure are known to accelerate cellular aging, to cause premature aging syndromes in exposed populations. The residents of areas near nuclear testing sites have historically shown elevated rates of certain diseases associated with premature aging. Moleman, if he is genuinely 31 and lives in Springfield, may represent the most extreme case of radiation-induced accelerated aging in the show's universe. Not just yellow skin and 4 fingers. Not just a third eye on the fish. An actual compression of biological time. This would also explain his recurring deaths and returns. If his biological processes are running at 2 or 3 times normal speed, the processes of damage and recovery may also be accelerated. What would be a permanent, fatal injury to a normal person might be survivable for a biological system running at accelerated speed because the repair mechanisms are also running at accelerated speed. The death is real. The recovery is also real. Both happen faster than they should. Moleman is perhaps the most extreme visible consequence of what the power plant has done to Springfield. Not the most prominent, not the most narratively important, but the most visible in biological terms, the character whose body most clearly displays what chronic nuclear contamination does to human tissue across an extended period of exposure. And he is in the background of nearly every scene. He is always there, hit by another car, crushed by another object, dying again, coming back again. The endless cycle of his particular disaster happening in the margins of every scene, visible to anyone who looks for it, ignored by everyone who does not. Springfield walks past Moleman every day. Springfield has always walked past Moleman. He is the answer to the question about what the plant is doing to the people, written in visible, undeniable biological form, in plain sight, on every street in town. Nobody looks. That is Springfield.